The year is around 4000 BC, give or take a few centuries, because at this point in human history, no one is counting yet. We're in southern Mesopotamia, the land the Greeks would later call between the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates drift lazily through an expanse of shimmering wetlands and dark silty soil. It's a place that doesn't look like much, a few mud huts, maybe some goats bleating in the reeds, but something extraordinary is about to happen here. Humanity is about to stumble into the idea of the city. The first settlers of this region were farmers and herders who had grown tired of the unpredictable moods of the rivers. The floods could be generous, one year, murderous the next, but those who stayed learned to read the water's rhythm. They dug canals with reed and wood tools, coaxing the rivers to behave, and in doing so, they unlocked one of nature's oldest safes, the silt of the Mesopotamian floodplain. Each year, that black earth arrived like a gift, thick with nutrients, endlessly renewing itself. It was as if the land wanted to grow things, barley, wheat, dates, onions, cucumbers, and humanity for once listened. Where there is food, there is time, and where there is time, there is imagination. People who once spent their days chasing herds or migrating with the seasons could now stay put, year after year, in the same patch of earth. Families became neighbors. Neighbors became communities. Before long, someone decided it might be a good idea to build their mud brick house next to someone else's, not out of friendship necessarily, but out of convenience. And just like that, the seeds of urban life were sown. Archaeologists who later dug into this landscape found the evidence of these early experiments in permanence. Beneath layers of sand and time, they uncovered simple rectangular houses, one room deep, arranged around small courtyards. The bricks were made from the same clay that surrounded them, sun-dried, rather than fired and stamped with the fingerprints of people who had no idea they were leaving the world's first urban blueprints. Inside those homes were grain bins, storage jars, grinding stones, a quiet record of a community that had mastered subsistence so completely that it could finally begin to dream of surplus. And what do humans do when they have a little extra? They trade, they build, they gossip. Someone figures out that the village needs a gathering place, a spot to store grain for hard times, or to offer gifts to the unseen powers believed to live in the sky. So at the center of this growing settlement, a platform rises, perhaps no more than a few feet high, at first made of stacked clay bricks. Upon it, a small shrine. It's humble now, but it's the ancestor of every skyscraper humanity will ever build. The first skyline is beginning to take shape in mud. The land itself almost conspired to make it happen. To the east lay the Iranian plateau, rich in metal and stone. To the south, the open waters that would one day lead to the Persian Gulf. And to the north and west, trade paths leading toward Anatolia and the Levant. Uruk sat right in the middle of this crossroads of rivers and deserts, a location that would eventually turn it into a magnet for traders, artisans, and dreamers. But at this point, it's still more village than city. It's people still. More farmers than citizens. Still something is changing in their rhythm of life. The work is different now, organized, deliberate. Canals have to be maintained, dikes repaired, harvests measured and shared. There are schedules, responsibilities, and inevitably arguments about who gets the best land and who forgot to close the floodgate. For the first time, humanity must coordinate on a scale larger than family or tribe. Cooperation becomes a technology as important as the plow. To build their world, the people of Uruk use what the land offers in abundance: mud and imagination. Clay becomes the material of civilization. It's molded into bricks for homes and walls, pots for storage, tablets for counting. The very landscape is turning human-shaped and environment remade by intention. We might imagine the air of early Uruk, thick with sounds that have never existed together, before the rhythmic splash of irrigation water, the clatter of pottery wheels, the bleating of goats, the shouted instructions of laborers hauling bricks. And somewhere, perhaps a priest is chanting to the sky, God Anu, asking him to bless this fragile new order. There's beauty in the ordinariness of it all. These people aren't thinking about founding civilization. They're just trying to keep their barley dry and their children fed. But each solution to a practical problem, how to store grain, how to track who owes what, pushes them further toward something unprecedented. In time, these clustered houses and shared canals will give way to organized streets, workshops, temples, and administrative buildings. Specialists will appear: masons, potters, priests, and traders. Some will build, others will count. Still others will pray for success in both. The community will grow until it crosses an invisible threshold and becomes more than a village. It becomes a system. And perhaps somewhere in that transformation, one resident of Uruk will look around and realize the truth that they no longer live in nature, but with it taming, channeling, building upon it. Humanity has entered a new relationship with the world, one that will never quite end. In a few centuries, the name Uruk will be spoken with reverence and pride. But here, at the dawn of it all, it's still just a cluster of sun-baked houses on the banks of a restless river. The people don't yet know that they're inventing the city, that the echoes of their footsteps will reach us 6,000 years later. They're simply living their lives beneath a sky that will one day be called the cradle of civilization. And in that cradle, something stirs the heartbeat of the world's first city. If you've ever wondered what civilization smells like, imagine this wet clay, sun-baked reeds, and the earthy sweetness of barley fermenting in the heat. That's Uruk in its infancy, a city not carved from stone, but coaxed from mud and water. It's hard to overstate how much those two elements shaped everything that followed. They weren't just resources, they were destiny. Southern Mesopotamia had no forests to speak of, no mountains, barely a pebble of decent stone. But it had rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, forever fighting and forever feeding the land. When they flooded, they left behind a film of rich, dark silt that gleamed like wet paint in the sun. That silt became soil, and that soil became food, and that food became people, lots of them. The population swelled, and suddenly the world's first problem of urban planning appeared: how to stop your entire livelihood from floating away every spring. So the people of Uruk turned engineering into a religion. They learned to shape the land with an audacity no one had ever tried before. They dug canals that stretched for kilometers, cut with wooden shovels and bare hands. They raised levees, built gates, and invented the idea of a maintenance schedule long before anyone called it that. If you wanted water for your fields, you'd better show up on canal cleaning day or risk the collective wrath of your neighbors. Civilization, it turns out, begins with the world's first neighborhood association. The result of all this muddy coordination was a miracle agriculture that didn't just survive, it flourished. Barley fields shimmered in the sun. Date palms rose in symmetrical rows, and vegetable gardens fed a city that was learning to dream bigger than any one harvest. The rivers once feared as unpredictable gods were now harnessed, persuaded, almost domesticated. Humanity had discovered that you could negotiate with nature provided you were willing to sweat. Of course, this wasn't done for free. Someone had to organize it all to decide where the canals went, who got water first, and how much each farmer owed the temple for its divine oversight. Slowly, the concept of hierarchy seeped into the soil as deeply as the irrigation water. The temple became the administrative heart of Uruk, half spiritual embassy, half accounting office. The gods received offerings. The priests received ledgers. Meanwhile, the people learned the delicate art of living shoulder to shoulder. The constant rhythm of irrigation made everyone's fortunes depend on everyone else's competence. A single clogged ditch could flood half a neighborhood, so cooperation wasn't optional, it was survival. But out of this uneasy partnership grew something extraordinary, the sense of belonging to a collective larger than one's kin or clan. Uruk wasn't just a settlement anymore. It was a shared idea, a network of trust obligation and mutual dependence. And then there was the mud. The endless, wonderful, exasperating mud. It was both the building block and the undoing of their world. They shaped it into bricks, stacked those bricks into walls, and used them to raise houses, temples, granaries, and workshops. Clay tablets stored their transactions. Clay pipes carried their water. Clay jars kept their beer. You could say Uruk was the first true clay-based economy. When the rains came, the walls sagged and melted, and people simply built them again. Permanence wasn't the point, continuity was. It's tempting to imagine the place as primitive, but the archaeological record tells another story. Even this early Uruk's irrigation system stretched for dozens of kilometers, managed by a complex web of canals, channels, and sluice gates. Barley and wheat grew in regimented rows. Oxen plowed the fields in teams. Water was measured and rationed according to season crop and social rank. It was a system so efficient that modern hydraulic engineers still study it with awe. And all this effort did something new to the human psyche. It made the environment predictable. People began to plan for the future, not just the next hunt or the next flood, but the next decade. They built granaries large enough to store surplus grain, anticipating droughts or trade. They started to experiment, plant new crops, breed stronger animals. Hope itself became institutionalized. The surplus changed everything. Suddenly, not everyone needed to farm. Some people could specialize, becoming potters, weavers, builders, or traders. Others became administrators, managing the flow of goods and labor. The city's metabolism quickened. Goods from far-off lands, wood from the mountains, stone from the deserts, lapis lazuli from the east, began to appear in Uruk's markets. For the first time in human history, a city wasn't just surviving off its own land, it was living off its relationships. This transformation didn't go unnoticed by its people. Imagine standing on the edge of one of those canals at dusk, watching the reflection of a half-finished ziggurat glow in the water. The air is thick with the scent of clay and smoke, the hum of frogs, the chatter of workers heading home. Somewhere, a reed flute plays a few crooked notes, and you realize you're witnessing the world reinventing itself. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment when the villagers of Uruk became citizens of Uruk, but it must have felt like this, a sudden awareness that they had built something bigger than themselves. Something that could outlast a lifetime. Something that could stand against the chaos of the rivers. The miracle of Uruk wasn't gold, or war, or invention. It was the realization that mud and water handled with cooperation, patience, and a touch of stubbornness could build not just walls, but a world. And beneath the heat and the flies, as barley rustled in the twilight and water whispered through the canals, humanity took its first deep breath as a civilization. If the first miracle of Uruk was that humans could make nature behave, the second was that they could make themselves behave more or less. By around 3800 BC, the once sleepy settlement had exploded into something entirely new, a city with a plan, not an accidental sprawl of huts, but a deliberate geometry of streets, courtyards, and workshops. It was as if someone had looked down at the mess of canals and houses and said, "Let's tidy this up. Shall we, civilization?" It turns out, has always owed a lot to the compulsively organized, Archaeologists can trace that change layer by layer. The earliest homes were huddled together, like gossiping relatives, uneven walls, narrow alleys, doors that opened onto mud. But then suddenly, the ground plan sharpens. Streets align with eerie precision. Buildings follow standardized measurements. You can almost sense the meeting that must have taken place, a group of elders or priests or exasperated farmers arguing over where the new main street should run, each one convinced the gods favored his side of the canal. This was the dawn of urban design, and it wasn't just aesthetic, it was functional. The streets were wide enough for donkey carts and foot traffic, the canals paralleled them for boats, and every district had its purpose. Near the temple rose the administrative quarter, where officials tracked the flow of grain, wool, and beer. Beyond that lay residential neighborhoods, arranged around courtyards shaded by woven reed canopies. Farther out were the workshops, where the thump of potters' wheels and the clang of metal workers echoed through the heat. The city had a rhythm now, a heartbeat that pulsed from sunrise to sunset. Picture it, the smell of clay kilns on the wind, the chatter of merchants bargaining over a jar of oil children, darting through alleys lined with baskets of drying fish. Evenings were filled with music, the twang of lyres, the beat of hand drums, voices rising with songs older than writing itself. For the first time in history, thousands of strangers could live side by side without collapsing into chaos. That required not only rules, but also trust and invisible architecture as vital as the bricks themselves. And speaking of bricks, Uruk had a lot of them. Millions. Each one molded by hand, sun-dried, and laid with a care that bordered on reverence. They weren't uniform by accident. They were standardized on purpose. The same brick size fit every wall, every foundation. It made repairs easier, construction faster. Somewhere in Uruk, there must have been a weary foreman muttering, "Measure twice, mold once." It was mass production in its embryonic form, a logistical marvel built from dirt. The scale of organization this required is almost hard to imagine. Every street layout, every drain channel, every temple foundation implied a chain of command, a concept of civic duty, and inevitably paperwork. Or more precisely, claywork. The earliest records we've found from this period are not poems or prayers, but lists workers assigned to canal crews, deliveries of grain to the temple rations of beer distributed to laborers. Bureaucracy may be dull, but it's what holds civilization together. Somewhere between, hand me that shovel and sign here, humanity invented administration. This was also when craft specialization took root. Certain quarters of Uruk buzzed with industry potters spinning wheels, with hypnotic speed weavers, churning out fine wool textiles, stonecutters shaping imported obsidian. Each craft developed its own symbols, its own gods, and no doubt its own gossip networks. You can imagine the potters rolling their eyes at the metalworkers, muttering that they always thought they were better than everyone else. Even then, cities had their office politics. What's remarkable is how intentional it all seems. The city didn't just grow, it was orchestrated. Archaeologists have found evidence of standardized door widths, planned drainage, and even early zoning noisy industries separated from elite housing by open courtyards or small plazas. It was a world built on rectangles and right angles, proof that geometry had become a civic virtue. And yet, for all its order, Uruk was alive. In the cool of the evening, people gathered in open squares to share bread and stories. Farmers came from the countryside with carts piled high with barley. Traders from the Zagros Mountains unloaded stone and copper. Scribes sat cross-legged on thresholds, scratching symbols into wet clay to record it all. The air must have been thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and the thrill of human connection. This was humanity's first taste of true urban energy, the intoxicating sense that life was bigger, faster, and endlessly new. Every invention seemed to spawn another. The wheel didn't just make transport easier, it inspired the potter's wheel. The potter's wheel led to surplus trade. Surplus trade led to accounting, and accounting well that would soon lead to writing. But we're not quite there yet. For now, Uruk hums with possibility. Its canals glitter like veins under the sun. Its walls climb higher each year. From the temple terraces, priests watch the horizon and whisper to the gods that dwell above. Down below, ordinary people finish another long day of work, unaware that they're living through the most important experiment in human history. A village has become a blueprint. A city has taken shape. And in its streets, neatly laid, perfectly measured, the future is walking barefoot in the dust. At some point, the people of Uruk looked up at the sky, squinted into the blistering sunlight, and decided that flat wasn't good enough anymore. It wasn't enough to build outward, they needed to build up. After all, if the gods lived in the heavens, it seemed only polite to meet them halfway. Thus began the age of monumental architecture, the moment when human hands tried to give shape to divine ambition. And nothing captured that ambition better than the ziggurat of Anu. Around 3500 BC, under the scorching Mesopotamian sun, thousands of workers gathered on the plain to construct something humanity had never attempted before, a mountain made of mud brick. There were no cranes, no pulleys, no iron chisels, just reed baskets sweat, and a vision so audacious it bordered on madness. The ziggurat was to be a stairway between earth and sky, a symbolic anchor for the gods, and a declaration that Uruk had outgrown mere survival. It now aspired to eternity. We know the Anu ziggurat rose some 40 meters above the plain, its terraces stacked like steps toward heaven. That might not sound tall by modern standards, but for people who had only ever seen horizon and flatness, it must have looked like the spine of the world itself. From miles away, travelers would have seen it shimmering through the desert haze, a man-made mountain in a land that had none. The scale of the project staggers the modern mind. Millions of mud bricks, each one molded, dried, and carried by hand. Archaeologists have found the fingerprints of those anonymous builders still pressed into the bricks 6,000 years later. The logistics alone are breathtaking raw clay, mixed with straw, molded in standardized sizes, baked in the sun, stacked with mathematical precision. Workers had to haul timber beams from distant mountains for reinforcement limestone blocks from quarries hundreds of kilometers away, and pitch for waterproofing. All of this coordinated without wheels, without metal, without written blueprints, only memory, voice, and faith. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a foreman probably yelled, "That wall's leaning again. Civilization, meet your oldest tradition," the frustrated project manager. But behind the sweat and shouting was something extraordinary: organization on a scale never seen before. To raise this mountain of mud required not just muscle, but structured teams, quotas, shifts, logistics, records. The very act of building the ziggurat helped invent government. Out of bricks and prayers rose not just a temple, but a hierarchy, a society arranged as neatly as the ziggurat steps. The Anu ziggurat wasn't merely a building, it was a cosmic statement. Each level represented a different layer of existence: the underworld, the earth, the heavens tied together by ramps and staircases. At its summit stood a gleaming temple, the house of Anu, the sky god. Imagine climbing those steps in the dawn light, the city spreading below, like a sea of clay rooftops, the canals glinting in gold. The wind off the river smells faintly of reeds and fire. From here, you could almost believe the world was orderly, that the gods were watching, that all the sweating and hauling and bricklaying had meaning. For the priests who served there, it certainly did. The temple wasn't only a religious site, It was the city's beating heart. Offerings flowed in from across Uruk barley beer textiles, precious stones. In return, the temple distributed food, managed trade, and oversaw construction. It was equal parts cathedral warehouse and city hall. And at the top of it all, quite literally, the gods. The ziggurat was a physical reminder that divine order trickled down from above through priests, scribes, and administrators to the people below. Yet amid all this solemn grandeur, it's hard not to smile at the irony the gods of the heavens were being worshipped in a building that required the dirtiest, most backbreaking labor imaginable. The divine was built out of dust. Every prayer was carried up those steps by calloused hands, and maybe that was the point, an unspoken acknowledgement that heaven, if it wanted to be close, had to be built from the stuff of earth. By now, Uruk was no longer a loose collection of neighborhoods. It was a city with a skyline, a place that announced itself to the world. Travelers from the north would have seen its towers long before they reached its gates. Traders steering boats down the Euphrates would have marked it as a beacon rising from the plain. Even its reflection in the canal waters must have seemed supernatural, a stairway suspended upside down in the ripples. But the ziggurat did more than dominate the landscape. It reshaped the mind. It told people that the world could be organized, measured, and stacked. That humans could imitate the heavens in brick form. It was both an act of devotion and a demonstration of control, a new kind of power that wasn't just spiritual, but civic. When night fell, oil lamps flickered along its terraces, and the temple glowed like a lantern hanging between heaven and earth. Priests performed rituals, their chants echoing down the slopes. From the city below, you could hear faint music and smell the burning incense drifting in the warm air. Somewhere in the crowd, a farmer might have looked up from his bowl of barley stew, squinting at the distant lights, and thinking that the gods must surely live there, in that glowing palace above. He wasn't wrong. In a way, they did. For atop that ziggurat, humanity had finally found a way to house its dreams, to lift them from mud to sky, one brick at a time. If the ziggurat of Anu was Uruk's beating heart, then its temples were the arteries pulsing with offerings, goods, and paperwork. Lots of paperwork. By around 3400 BC, Uruk wasn't just a city of farmers and builders anymore. It was a metropolis of specialists, merchants, priests, and administrators, each of them deeply invested in a grand, complicated system that made sure everyone got fed, paid, and taxed in all the right proportions. Civilization, as it turns out, is mostly the story of keeping receipts. Walk with me through a day in that temple district. The air is hot and buzzing with flies. Outside the gleaming terraces of the Anu and Inanna complexes, lines of laborers shuffle forward, baskets of barley balanced on their heads. Officials squat behind clay counters, tallying each offering as it arrives. A scribe dips a reed into wet clay, pressing neat wedge-shaped marks that mean 5 jars of oil or 3 bolts of wool. Another scribe adds the symbol for temple stock, while a priest murmurs a blessing over the goods. And just like that, the world's first supply chain transaction is complete. No barcodes, no spreadsheets, just clay and sunlight. But these tablets weren't trivial. They were revolutionary. Before writing memory ruled, the oldest and loudest voices controlled the truth. But clay didn't forget. A scratched mark could outlast its maker by centuries. The first scribes weren't poets, they were accountants. Their job was to track labor grain and taxes for the temple. The irony is almost poetic. The written word began as bureaucracy's love letter to itself. Inside the temple, compounds, everything was humming with coordination. One courtyard might be filled with women spinning wool. Another echoed with the rhythmic pounding of flour mills. kitchens brewed the beer that served as the workers' daily wage. Yes, the world's first HR department paid in beer, an idea some modern offices might consider revisiting. Elsewhere, artisans crafted ornaments, jewelry, and sacred vessels for the gods, all under priestly supervision. This wasn't just faith, it was full-scale industry disguised as devotion. The temple owned vast tracts of farmland, tended by dependent workers who owed their harvests as offerings. Oxen plows and seed grain were loaned out by temple administrators who recorded every transaction on clay tablets. If you borrowed 2 oxen and returned one limping, there was likely a scribe somewhere ready to document your debt in triplicate. For the first time, an economy had rules, contracts, and inevitably penalties. And this new system demanded hierarchy. At the top were the high priests, who claimed to interpret the god's will and conveniently also controlled the flow of wealth. Below them were officials, scribes, and foremen, the early bureaucrats who managed irrigation schedules, distributed rations, and supervised labor crews. Beneath them, the mass of workers and farmers who did the actual sweating. The temple had become more than a place of worship. It was an institution, a prototype for both government and corporation. Trade, too, was no longer a matter of chance. Uruk's position at the crossroads of rivers and caravan routes made it a magnet for commerce. Boats floated down the Euphrates loaded with reeds, fish, and grain. Traders from the north brought timber and stone. From the east came metals and lapis lazuli, glowing like captured sky. Even the distant lands of Iran and Anatolia sent emissaries. The people of Uruk had begun to look beyond their own horizon, and what they saw was profit. The temples became the clearinghouses of this commerce. Imported goods were cataloged, stored, and redistributed by temple officials. Foreign traders might never deal directly with the city's citizens, they negotiated with the gods' representatives. Every piece of obsidian, every basket of wool, every fish in a jar was technically a sacred transaction. In the divine bureaucracy of Uruk, even the smallest trade was an act of worship. And yet, despite all the reverence, there's something deeply human in how it all unfolded. You can almost imagine the grumbling of workers in the temple courtyards, comparing rations and complaining that the priesthood had once again miscounted the beer deliveries. There were probably side deals, small acts of rebellion, and creative interpretations of divine instructions, because no bureaucracy is complete without a little creative accounting. The sheer scale of the operation boggles the mind. Archaeologists have found storerooms large enough to hold hundreds of tons of grain, and entire archives of tablets documenting every delivery, every ration, every debt. This was humanity's first experiment with data management. The temple administrators weren't just counting food, they were counting people resources time. In the process, they were inventing a new kind of power information. With that power came transformation. The city's layout itself reflected its new hierarchy. The temples rose high, their terraces glinting in the sun, while the dwellings of craftsmen and laborers sprawled below. Streets radiated outward from the sacred precinct like veins from a heart. The gods, it seemed, were both landlords and employers. Every canal and wall was built with divine labor taxes, every brick stamped with prayers, or perhaps with the ancient equivalent of a brand logo. But here's the twist: it worked. Uruk's temple economy produced such efficiency that the city could sustain tens of thousands of people. Surplus grain fed artisans who no longer farmed. Workshops expanded. Artists carved intricate cylinder seals, tiny rolling stamps used to sign documents and mark property. The designs, swirling with gods, animals, and geometric patterns, were both art and identification card. Civilization had invented not just writing, but signature. And as the records multiplied, so did imagination. Those simple accounting marks began to evolve symbols for goods turned into symbols for ideas. Somewhere in the archives of Uruk, a scribe must have realized that a clay tablet could say more than 3 goats or 10 jars of beer. It could tell a story. From ledgers, literature was only a few steps away. Standing in that temple complex, you could almost feel history condensing. The clatter of reeds on clay, the low hum of prayer, the scent of incense and baked mud. It was the sound and smell of civilization crystallizing. From this web of trade faith and bureaucracy would emerge the patterns that defined humanity for millennia: record-keeping, hierarchy, taxation, governance. It's easy to see temples as relics of superstition, but in Uruk, they were laboratories for civilization. They taught people to cooperate, to specialize, to imagine abstract systems that bound them together. They turned chaos into order and faith into infrastructure. And somewhere, in that grand sacred maze of courtyards and storerooms, a young apprentice scribe, squinting in the lamplight, pressed a reed into clay and unknowingly altered human destiny. What he wrote wasn't poetry or law or myth. It was a list, a humble practical record of temple rations. But in that act, he gave birth to something that would outlast empires. For in Uruk, amid the hum of trade and the murmur of prayers, writing itself was about to be born. Picture this: the sun has barely crested the Mesopotamian horizon, and already the temple scribes are at work. In the cool shade of the courtyard, young apprentices kneel beside baskets of clay, scooping out handfuls of the wet gray earth that once lined the canals. They roll it into tablets the size of their palms, smoothing the surface with the practiced patience of those who know that every mark they make will outlive them. Then with slender reed styluses, they begin to press, not draw press, tiny deliberate wedges in neat rows. Each mark means something concrete: barley sheep beer rations. The scene might not look revolutionary, but make no mistake, this is one of the greatest turning points in human history. Here in the temple courtyards of Uruk, writing is being invented. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it began with simple clay tokens, small thumb-sized counters shaped like spheres, cones, or discs. Each shape represented a particular commodity: a jar of oil, a sheep, a basket of grain. These tokens were stored in sealed clay envelopes bulle used to record deliveries and payments. When disputes arose, someone could break open the bulla and count the tokens inside. Primitive, yes, but reliable. Then at some point, someone had a moment of genius, or maybe impatience. Why bother enclosing the tokens when you could simply press their shapes onto the clay surface itself? That tiny leap of logic turned 3-dimensional accounting into 2-dimensional writing. The first tablets were nothing poetic. They were lists, ledgers, tallies of goods moving in and out of the temple. Each pictograph represented a physical thing: a sheep's head for livestock, a jar for oil, a sheaf for barley. But as the system grew more complex, the scribes had to get creative. They began combining symbols, modifying them, using marks to indicate numbers or sounds. Clay, in all its humble stickiness, had become a canvas for thought. By around 3400 BC, this proto-writing had evolved into something we can recognize: a systematic script. Archaeologists call it proto-cuneiform, the ancestor of the wedge-shaped writing that would dominate Mesopotamia for 3,000 years. The marks were no longer just pictures, but abstract signs pressed by a stylus, held at an angle, creating the distinctive triangular wedges, cuneus in Latin. It wasn't art anymore. It was information made permanent. And what a strange magic it must have seemed. For the first time, words could exist outside the human voice. Knowledge could travel farther than a messenger's memory, last longer than a lifetime. A dead man could still speak through clay. In a world where everything was fragile, mud brick walls, reed roofs, human breath, this was immortality in baked earth. Of course, the invention of writing didn't make life simpler. It made it infinitely more complicated. Suddenly, someone had to learn this new skill, and not everyone could. So emerged a new kind of elite, the scribes. They were the engineers of language, the accountants of reality, and let's be honest, the original nerds. They trained for years, memorizing hundreds of signs, practicing until their hands moved like machines. In the archives of Uruk, archaeologists have found their practice tablets filled with repetitive drills: barley, 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 sheep, sheep, sheep. It's both tedious and touching a glimpse into humanity's first classroom. These scribes became indispensable. The temple needed them to record taxes, contracts, and inventories. Merchants needed them to keep track of shipments. Even farmers needed them to document land boundaries and debts. Without a scribe, you had no proof, no record, no history. Literacy was power, and power flowed through clay. Yet writing had a strange side effect. It began to create something abstract, an almost dangerous memory outside the mind. When things could be written down, they could also be disputed, archived, compared. For the first time, humans could question their own records, argue over numbers, trace responsibilities. The clay tablet, as humble as it looked, was a social weapon. A man could now say, "Check the records," and everyone knew he was serious. And as the scribes became more confident, they began experimenting. Not all tablets were pure administration. Some show signs of imagination, creeping in sketches of offerings to gods, fragments of hymns, even proto-mythic stories that would one day evolve into the Epic of Gilgamesh. What began as accounting began to flirt with storytelling. The human mind, once unleashed onto clay, couldn't stop itself from dreaming. But let's not romanticize too quickly. Writing was hard work. Every tablet had to be shaped and scribed, while damp, then dried or baked. Mistakes couldn't be erased easily. They were scraped off, leaving scars on the surface. The clay cracked under the Mesopotamian sun. The stylus dulled after a few uses. You can almost imagine an exasperated scribe sighing, "Why couldn't the gods have invented paper?" Still, the effort was worth it. Writing stabilized society in ways that no one could have predicted. It allowed for consistent taxation, legal codes, long-distance trade, and complex administration. Uruk could now communicate with its satellite towns and trading partners hundreds of kilometers away through tablets that carried sealed impressions, signed, sealed, and legally binding. Bureaucracy had gone portable. And while all this clay accounting might sound dull, it was also beautiful. The symbols themselves, graceful wedges pressed in rhythmic patterns, possessed an artistry of their own. Each line carried weight, precision, purpose. When archaeologists uncovered these tablets millennia later, they found not just lists of livestock, but living echoes of thought, the first recorded human attempts to control chaos with symbols. As the script evolved, so did its reach. What began in Uruk spread rapidly across Mesopotamia. Cities like Uruk and Lagash adopted cuneiform for their own languages, modifying it as needed. The system became a shared technology, a common tongue for commerce and governance long before globalization had a name. To read and write cuneiform was to be connected to a civilization that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Anatolian highlands. Think about that. In a world where most people's entire universe was the distance they could walk in a day, these scribes were already part of a vast network of correspondence, trade, and law. The first global information system wasn't digital, it was clay. It's easy standing in the present to take writing for granted. We see it everywhere, glowing on screens, printed on cereal boxes, scribbled on sticky notes. But for the people of Uruk, every mark was sacred. To write something down was to give it permanence, to pull it out of the river of forgetting. In a city built of mud that would melt away each time the rains came, the clay tablet was the one thing that endured. There's a kind of poetry in that, isn't there? Civilization born in a land of impermanence invents permanence itself. By the time the scribes of Uruk had perfected their wedge-shaped handwriting, the city was no longer content to sit still. It had begun to hum, literally and figuratively. From dawn to dusk, Uruk was a symphony of motion and invention, wheels turning kilns, roaring looms, clattering boats creaking on the canals. Humanity, having mastered the art of counting its goods, now seemed determined to multiply them. Let's start with the wheel. It's such a simple shape that it feels eternal, but someone had to think of it first, and they did right here in Mesopotamia. The first wheels weren't for chariots or carts, but for pottery. Around 3500 BC, the potter's wheel appeared a spinning disc mounted horizontally on an axle. Before this, pots were hand-shaped or coiled, each one slightly irregular, like the baker's bread of an early morning market. But with the wheel, a potter could shape hundreds of identical vessels in a fraction of the time. It was mass production before the Industrial Revolution, assembly line thinking, before anyone had the words for it. Archaeologists have found those early wheels worn smooth at their centers from hours of use. You can picture the potter barefoot rhythmically spinning the wheel, with his foot, one hand, steadying the clay, while the other coaxed it into graceful symmetry. The air thick with the smell of wet earth and smoke. Rows of finished vessels drying in the sun storage jars, oil pots, beer mugs, all uniform, all perfect. That small revolution in speed and standardization didn't just change pottery, it changed the rhythm of labor itself. Time became something measurable, repeatable, efficient. But Uruk's inventors weren't done. Around the same era, someone looked at a riverboat and thought, this would be easier if the wind did some of the work. The result was the sail, a rectangle of woven cloth raised on a wooden mast, catching the breeze and turning the slow, grueling act of rowing into something elegant and, dare we say, relaxing. The earliest depictions of sailboats come from Uruk seals and pottery narrow reed vessels with triangular sails billowing softly. For the first time, humans could move against the current. That one innovation opened the world. The canals of Uruk became arteries of commerce, carrying grain textiles and pottery downstream toward the Persian Gulf, where traders connected with maritime routes stretching as far as Oman and the Indus Valley. Wooden barges glided past fields, and ziggurats, their sails glowing in the late afternoon sun like sheets of gold. Goods that had once taken weeks to transport by donkey now arrived in days. Uruk's merchants were not just trading, they were expanding the known world, one breeze at a time. And as the merchants grew bolder, so did the craftsmen. The city became a workshop on a monumental scale. In the industrial quarters, furnaces roared as metalworkers smelted copper brought from distant mountains. The air shimmered with heat as they hammered and poured forging tools, weapons, and ornaments. Nearby bead makers strung carnelian and lapis lazuli into jewelry fit for gods and kings. Stone carvers etched tiny, intricate cylinder seals whose designs carried legal authority and divine symbolism alike. Each craft had its own secrets, its own guild of masters and apprentices, a whisper network of innovation stretching across the centuries. If you were to wander through Uruk's craft districts at midday, it would look and sound like a living machine. A chorus of activity hammers striking bronze potters shaping clay women at looms, weaving fine wool into patterned cloth men stirring vats of dye in vivid blues and reds. The smells would be intoxicating: smoke oil sweat, and the faint sweetness of freshly baked clay. Civilization had acquired not only a structure, but a texture, a world built by hands that understood both function and beauty. And those hands were busy. Pottery workshops turned out thousands of standardized vessels, stamped with distinctive marks, the earliest branding, if you will. Textile mills employed hundreds, turning raw wool into fine cloth that became Uruk's calling card in trade. Metal workshops produced blades and plows, with uniform quality evidence that quality control existed long before spreadsheets. The city wasn't just making things. It was thinking systematically about how to make them better. There's a quiet, profound genius in that. The same impulse that drove scribes to standardize symbols also pushed craftsmen to standardize form. A pot, a tablet, a brick all followed predictable ratios. It made replacement easy, training faster, repairs smoother. A sense of order that most Mesopotamian of obsessions permeated everything from administration to artistry. Even so, not everything in Uruk's workshops was practical. Luxury was alive and well. The temple administrators commissioned elaborate statues of gods and mythical beasts, gold-leafed eyes staring out from alabaster faces. Carved reliefs showed scenes of processions and offerings, their lines crisp, their figures strangely modern. The artistry wasn't just decoration. It was propaganda in clay. It reminded citizens that their city, their labor, their very creativity, all of it belonged to the gods. But not everyone saw it that way. You can almost sense the quiet rebellion of the craftsman, proud of his skill, knowing that his own hands, not divine favor, shaped these wonders. When a pot spun perfectly on its wheel, or a copper blade gleamed sharp and true, the maker must have felt a flicker of something new. Personal pride, maybe even identity. Civilization was giving birth not only to systems, but to selves. And it was spreading. The goods of Uruk, its pottery, its textiles, its bronze tools traveled farther than any civilization before it. Excavations in Syria, Turkey, and Iran have unearthed artifacts unmistakably Urukian in style. Some were traded. Others belonged to colonies founded by Uruk merchants. The city's influence radiated outward like ripples in a canal, its technologies transforming the societies they touched. In its own quiet, bureaucratic way, Uruk had become an empire of ideas. All this progress, however, came with an undercurrent of tension. Growth meant dependence on trade, on irrigation, on the temple's administration. As life grew easier, it also grew more fragile. A broken canal could mean famine. A failed shipment could ripple through the system. For all its sophistication, Uruk was balanced precariously on the thin line between abundance and collapse. Still standing on the terrace of the ziggurat at sunset, the people of Uruk must have felt invincible. Below them stretched a city alive with motion sails drifting down the canal, smoke curling from workshops, the hum of industry carrying across the fields. Humanity, once at the mercy of the elements, was now bending them to its will. The wheel turned, the sail filled, and the city thrived. By about 3500 BC, Uruk was bursting at the seams, too wealthy, too organized, too ambitious to stay confined within its walls of baked mud. The city's scribes could count every sack of grain, its priests could bless every canal, but the workshops kept churning out more than the locals could ever use. Copper, timber, and stone, all essential to fuel the city's appetite, were scarce in the flat delta lands of southern Mesopotamia. And so, Uruk began to look outward, its merchants and priests tracing the ribbons of the rivers and desert trails that threaded the known world. It's tempting to imagine the first wave of Uruk traders as ancient entrepreneurs. But the truth is even grander. They were the agents of humanity's first cultural expansion, the prototype of globalization. What Athens and Rome would later do with marble and Empire Uruk did with clay and commerce. Picture a caravan setting out from the city at dawn. The sun glows red over the canals as teams of donkeys groan under loads of textiles, ceramics, and fine crafted goods. Behind them, priests recite blessings to Inanna for safe passage and fair exchange. The merchants travel north along the Euphrates, through the dry steppe, toward lands rich in metals, stone, and timber. The journey is long, the desert winds brutal, but the rewards immense. When these traders reached distant villages, they brought more than goods. They brought a system. Their pottery was stamped with familiar symbols, their tablets inscribed with early cuneiform signs, their administrative methods astonishing to local chiefs who had never seen such order. The Uruk merchants didn't merely trade, they replicated the rhythm of their city wherever they went. They built small enclaves with the same rectangular homes, central courtyards, and temple-like buildings. In a sense, they franchised civilization. Archaeologists call this the Uruk expansion. Across what's now Syria, Turkey, and western Iran, traces of these colonial outposts have been found, each unmistakably bearing the fingerprint of the mother city. The best preserved lies at Habuba Kabira on the Euphrates in modern Syria, an entire planned town built in Uruk's image. Standardized houses, central warehouses, administrative buildings, even workshops producing identical pottery. It's as if a piece of southern Mesopotamia had been teleported 800 kilometers away. Why go to all that trouble? Partly to control trade, partly to secure resources. But there's also a subtler reason: ideology. To the people of Uruk, their way of life, orderly, literate, bureaucratic, wasn't just efficient, it was right. They saw their civilization as the natural center of the human world, and spreading it was an act of both profit and piety. The gods, after all, deserved proper management everywhere. At these far-flung colonies, the rhythms of Uruk life repeated like an echo. Canals were dug, temples raised, tablets pressed. Local laborers learned to read Mesopotamian symbols, to measure grain in standard units, to stamp seals on jars that guaranteed authenticity. Bit by bit, an international language of trade and trust was born. A merchant from Uruk could travel from the Tigris to the Taurus Mountains and find familiar systems, waiting weights, measures, contracts, seals. Civilization had created its first global operating manual. The goods that flowed through these networks dazzled the senses. From Anatolia came copper and silver. From Iran, precious stones and timber. From the Levant, wine oil and cedar wood. In return, Uruk exported textiles, fine ceramics, and its greatest commodity, administration. Every ledger, every seal impression, every rule for fair exchange originated in the counting houses of Uruk's temples. If the colonies wanted to prosper, they needed the system as much as the goods. Trade also carried something less tangible: stories, symbols, and styles. Uruk's distinctive artistic motifs, rows of horned bulls' temple facades, and robed priests appear in distant lands, carved into local stone or painted on pottery. Even the architecture followed. Across hundreds of miles, new settlements adopted the same rectangular courtyards and ziggurat-like platforms. You could walk into a temple in faraway Susa or Arslan Tepe and feel you were still standing in the shadow of Uruk. And yet this expansion wasn't conquest, not in the sword and shield sense. There's little evidence of mass violence or imposed rule. Instead, Uruk's empire was one of persuasion, profit, and prestige. Local leaders welcomed its traders because association with Uruk meant access to goods, to knowledge, to legitimacy. Civilization was a brand, and everyone wanted to wear it. Still, maintaining far-flung networks wasn't easy. Caravans could vanish into sandstorms. Riverboats could founder in floods. Communication relied on messengers traveling for weeks, with clay tablets tucked safely in reed baskets. And though Uruk's bureaucracy was efficient, it wasn't immune to human folly. A delayed shipment of copper might send a scribe into a panic, or a regional overseer might decide to skim a little barley off the records. Somewhere out there in the dusty archives of a forgotten outpost lies the world's first example of creative bookkeeping. What makes the Uruk expansion so astonishing isn't merely its reach, but its coherence. Despite the distances involved, these colonies remained culturally tethered to their homeland. Archaeologists find the same cylinder seals, the same beveled rim bowls, the same numerical tablets, all stamped with unmistakable uniformity. The people of Uruk had effectively standardized civilization. But expansion had side effects. As Uruk's influence spread, its wealth grew, and so did inequality. Elites back home thrived on imported luxuries, their houses adorned with lapis lazuli and carnelian. Meanwhile, laborers toiled in workshops and fields to sustain the machine. The world's first middle managers emerged overseers, administrators, professional merchants, each layer feeding on the one below. In the ledgers of the gods, everyone had their place. At the same time, something remarkable was happening: cultural diffusion. As Uruk exported its systems, it also absorbed others. Foreign artisans introduced new motifs and techniques. Traders brought exotic foods, fabrics, and ideas. The city became a melting pot of languages and customs, proof that even in antiquity, globalization was a two-way street. Still, you can't expand forever. By around 3100 BC, the Uruk network began to strain. Climate shifts dried up river channels. Trade routes changed. Some colonies were abandoned, their streets left eerily silent. Others evolved into independent cities, carrying Uruk's DNA into new civilizations. But for a brief, brilliant century or two, one city's culture had reached from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Imagine standing on the ziggurat during that golden age, looking out across the floodplain. The city stretches endlessly: fields, canals, walls, workshops, and beyond them, caravans disappearing toward distant horizons. You'd hear the faint murmur of languages from foreign traders, the rhythmic slap of sails on the canal, the temple bells calling priests to evening prayers. Uruk was the axis of the known world, a hub where gods and goods met, where every jar of oil and every idea passed through human hands before traveling outward again. We sometimes talk about the modern world as connected and globalized, as if we invented the concept. But 6,000 years ago, long before anyone had heard of Wi-Fi or the Silk Road, the people of Uruk had already built an international network of trade, ideas, and faith. Their empire wasn't powered by armies or algorithms, but by clay wind and trust. If Uruk's ziggurats were its soul, and its workshops its muscles, then its archives were the nervous system, the delicate pulsing network that kept the city alive. By around 3300 BC, every transaction, every harvest, every head of cattle was being tracked, recorded, and filed away. It was a civilization obsessed with remembering itself, one tablet at a time. Beneath the incense and grandeur of its temples ran an invisible machinery of control: clay, reed, and rule. Step inside a temple office during the height of Uruk's power. The air is warm, heavy with the smell of oil lamps. Rows of scribes sit cross-legged on woven mats, surrounded by stacks of tablets, still damp from yesterday's work. They aren't writing poetry or hymns. They're tallying grain deliveries, tax quotas, and labor assignments. One young scribe wipes sweat from his brow and mutters under his breath as his stylus skids across the clay, another smudged wedge, another mistake to scrape away. Somewhere nearby, a supervisor counts under his breath, tapping each tablet before it's placed carefully on a shelf to dry. Outside, the city hums, but here, in the record rooms, time slows to the rhythm of a stylus. The scribes' lives are monotonous, yet crucial. Without them, nothing moves. The temple can't feed its workers. The workshops can't claim materials the merchants can't trade, and the gods those ever-hungry deities would starve for offerings. Every brick of the ziggurat, every loaf of temple bread, has a corresponding tablet that says it exists. Civilization, it turns out, runs not on faith or force, but on documentation. And that's where the cylinder seal comes in, a masterpiece of bureaucracy, disguised as jewelry. These small, carved stone cylinders, often no larger than a thumb, were the signatures of their time. Roll one across wet clay, and an entire scene would unfurl a priest before a god, a merchant weighing silver, a procession of oxen or jars. Each seal was unique, its intricate design, both identification and artwork. Officials wore them on cords around their necks, the ancient equivalent of a passport credit card and brand logo rolled into one. To modernize, they're beautiful tiny works of art. But to the people of Uruk, they were deadly serious. Without a seal, your transaction didn't exist. Your claim had no authority. Merchants used them to secure shipments, priests to confirm offerings, bureaucrats to approve rations. Some even used double seals, one for the temple, one for the worker, to ensure fairness, or at least the illusion of it. The impression of a seal was as binding as a signature today, and likely inspired as many arguments. Imagine a harried overseer bursting into the record room. Where is the seal for the canal project? Panic ensues. Apprentices scramble through stacks of tablets, dust rising in the lamplight. Losing a seal impression could mean losing track of hundreds of workers, or worse, offending the gods. Somewhere in the background, a weary clerk mutters the first recorded version of a timeless office phrase. It's not my department. All of this, the tablets, the seals, the ledgers, wasn't just about efficiency. It was about power. The ability to record was the ability to rule. The priests and administrators of Uruk didn't command armies. They commanded information. They knew who owed what, who worked where, how much grain had been stored, and how much could be taxed. Knowledge became currency, and the archives of Uruk became the world's first treasury of data. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of these tablets, each one a snapshot of this machine in motion. Some record lists of rations: 2 jars of beer for the bricklayer, 1 loaf of bread for the canal worker. Others document massive construction projects complete with calculations of materials and labor. A few remarkably preserve legal agreements, sales of land loans, marriages. On one, a line reads simply, "If the ox is not returned, payment shall be made in silver." You can almost hear the weary resignation of whoever wrote it. Civilization had invented both the contract and the lawsuit. But it wasn't all dry record-keeping. These archives also preserved the first whispers of law ethics and accountability. To keep order among thousands of citizens, Uruk's administrators needed rules, clear written ones. A standard weight for barley, a fixed rate for silver, a defined portion of beer for labor. Once recorded, these could be enforced. The written record replaced the fickle memory of witnesses, turning justice from persuasion into procedure. It's remarkable to think that bureaucracy, so often the butt of jokes, was once a radical invention. The idea that society could run according to written norms rather than personal relationships was revolutionary. Before Uruk, your fate depended on who you knew. After Uruk, it depended on what was written about you in the clay. The pen, or rather the reed stylus, had become mightier than the spear. Still, for every triumph of order, there was the chaos it tried to contain. Uruk's archives hint at human frailty behind the system. Lost records, duplicated tallies, even corrections scrawled hastily into wet clay. Bureaucracy had invented its own nemesis, clerical error. Somewhere in the distant hum of the temple offices, a supervisor probably sighed and muttered, "We'll fix it in the next census." The temple wasn't the only source of documentation. Private merchants began keeping their own tablets receipts for goods lists of partners, debts owed. Trade had become complex enough to require not just trust, but proof. Clay tablets, once the exclusive property of the gods, were becoming the paperwork of the people. Literacy crept outward from the temple walls, one transaction at a time. And with it came a subtle shift in identity. A scribe might still serve the gods, but he also served the state. An overseer might record rations for the temple, but he knew that his seal, his mark, carried power in its own right. The tools of administration were becoming tools of authority. Somewhere between the lines of grain tallies and livestock counts, government was being born. The scale of organization this required boggles the modern mind. Tens of thousands of citizens, miles of canals, hundreds of workshops, all coordinated through written records, seals, and signatures. It was as if Uruk had transformed itself into a living organism. Its scribes, the neurons, transmitting information, its temples, the brain processing it, its canals and roads, the veins and arteries carrying sustenance. And like any organism, it had learned to regulate itself, to measure, correct, and control. Yet beneath the surface of this astonishing order, one can sense a hint of unease. The same system that sustained the city also constrained it. To be written down was to be known, and to be known was to be managed. Farmers no longer worked for themselves, but for quotas. Artisans produced not for passion, but for allocation. Every jar of oil and loaf of bread had a place in someone's ledger. Civilization had created abundance, but at the cost of spontaneity. Still step back and look at the larger picture. The people of Uruk had done something miraculous. They had built a city that thought, remembered, and acted. The clay tablets resting in the archives weren't just records. They were the city's memory, the prototype of everything that would follow: law codes, libraries, ledgers, and literature. The scribes who hunched over their work by lamplight didn't know it, but they were programming the first bureaucracy, the first computer made of minds and clay. For all its shimmering temples and humming workshops, the city of Uruk was not a paradise. Beneath its ordered grids and careful records, something new and uneasy had begun to take root: hierarchy. You could see it in the architecture long before anyone wrote it down. On the high terraces of the sacred district, priests and administrators lived in sprawling mud brick compounds with painted walls and private courtyards. In the low quarters by the canals, laborers and farmers crowded into small single-room homes, baked by the sun and surrounded by the stench of their own animals. Civilization had found its rhythm, but it was playing in different keys. The archaeologists who excavated Uruk could literally read inequality in the ground. They found palatial houses in the temple district, fortified, decorated, even furnished with small bathrooms drained by clay pipes. These buildings had storerooms filled with imported goods, carved stone bowls, copper tools, jewelry, inlaid with lapis lazuli and carnelian from lands hundreds of miles away. The homes of ordinary people were another story: cramped rooms built around shared courtyards, floors of packed earth, cooking fires blackening the walls. Their treasures were more modest broken pots, patched with bitumen tools worn down to the nub. The contrast between rich and poor had been etched into the bricks themselves. It wasn't always this way. In the early days of the village, No one owned much more than anyone else. Food and labor were shared decisions made communally. But as the city grew, someone had to coordinate the work, assign irrigation crews, allocate fields, collect offerings. And with coordination came control. The priests who managed the temples became not just spiritual guides, but economic managers. They decided who got grain and who didn't, who worked for the gods and who merely served those who did. A few generations later, those who held the stylus and seal found themselves in charge of those who held the shovel. Uruk was becoming something the world had never seen before a stratified society. At the top stood the temple elite priests, scribes, administrators, who claimed divine sanction for their authority. Beneath them, merchants and master craftsmen formed a middle layer of specialists who thrived on trade. At the base, the vast majority farmers, laborers, herders, and slaves bound by duty or debt. Somewhere in between were the foremen and supervisors, the earliest middle managers of history, caught in that timeless squeeze between orders from above and complaints from below. The written record of this transformation is subtle but telling. In the oldest tablets, people are referred to simply by profession farmer, potter, herder. Later new words appear: overseer, steward, administrator. And alongside them, another vocabulary emerges: words for tribute, rent, interest. The concept of debt, that quiet parasite of civilization, had been born. The temple's economy encouraged it. Workers received food rations instead of wages distributed through temple stores. A family that fell behind on its obligations might borrow grain from the temple to survive repaying it with labor or produce later. But as records grew more precise, so did expectations. What began as mutual aid turned into obligation, then into control. The city's clay tablets, so proud, so methodical, became instruments of accountability, and therefore of inequality. Even death reflected the divide. Excavations in Uruk cemeteries show two very different afterlives. The poor were laid in shallow pits, wrapped in reed mats or simple shrouds, accompanied by a clay bowl or two for offerings. The elite, on the other hand, rested in tomb chambers, lined with bricks, furnished with furniture, weapons, and jewelry. Some were buried with gold and silver ornaments, others with imported stone vessels carved in geometric patterns. One grave, believed to belong to a high-ranking priest, contained dozens of sacrificed animals and perhaps human attendants. The gods had evidently acquired a taste for hierarchy too. To the people of Uruk, these divisions may not have felt unjust. They saw them as natural, even divine. The priests claimed that social order mirrored cosmic order, the heavens above, the earth below. Each person had their place, just as the stars had their fixed paths. The ziggurat itself embodied this worldview, its summit for the gods, its base for mortals, each layer dependent on the one beneath it. Inequality was baked into the architecture of faith. Still, it's not hard to imagine moments of friction. A potter whose ration was docked, a farmer whose canal allotment was cut, a laborer who worked one too many temple projects without payment. Perhaps they grumbled in the beer halls at night, the clay mugs sweating in their hands as they whispered about unfair scribes or greedy priests. Civilization may have invented bureaucracy, but it also invented resentment. And yet even the oppressed were invested in the system. The temple provided food, in lean years, organized irrigation, and kept the floods in check. The priests' rituals promised divine favor for good harvests. Order, however unfair, was safer than chaos. People accepted inequality because the alternative was the unpredictable terror of nature itself. The gods, they believed, had created humanity to work, and the temple merely administered their divine plan. If you walked through Uruk on a festival day, you might see how this social structure was celebrated as much as enforced. The high priests processed through the streets in glittering robes, incense rising in clouds around them. Behind them marched scribes and officials carrying the temple seals and tablets as if they were holy relics. Craftsmen displayed their finest goods. Farmers brought their best grain. At the back of the parade, the laborers followed with baskets of offerings. The hierarchy was laid out for all to see, a living ziggurat of flesh and fabric, each layer supporting the one above. And yet, within that rigid structure, something profoundly human persisted pride. A mason might point to a wall he built and say, "That's my work right there." A potter might boast that her jars were chosen for the temple kitchens. Even the canal diggers could take satisfaction in knowing that the river obeyed their labor. For all its inequality, Uruk thrived because its people, rich and poor alike, believed their work mattered. But the cracks were there, literal and metaphorical. As the elites consolidated power, they grew distant from the people whose sweat sustained them. The temple complexes expanded, swallowing more land, demanding more tribute. Record-keeping grew increasingly elaborate, as if the scribes were trying to control the world by naming it faster than it could change. Somewhere in those thousands of tablets lies the first recorded complaint about taxes. The irony is that inequality, though it strained the city, also fueled its achievements. The surplus, controlled by the elite, funded monumental construction, supported scholars, and financed long-distance trade. Without hierarchy, there might have been no ziggurats, no writing, no history at all. Civilization, it seems, was born not in equality, but in tension. The constant negotiation between ambition and necessity, privilege and dependence. As dusk falls over Uruk, the ziggurat glows in the fading light, its upper terraces shimmering like gold, while the lower quarters sink into shadow. From a distance, it's beautiful, a symbol of human ingenuity. But if you look closely, the pattern of light and darkness reveals the truth of the city that built it. Greatness shining above, toil hidden below. By around 2700 BC, Uruk had reached a strange, magnificent maturity. The temples still dominated the skyline, the canals still shimmered under the Mesopotamian sun, but the city's rhythm had changed. It no longer spoke only the language of priests and scribes. A new voice had entered the conversation, a voice of command, of ambition, of self. For the first time, power in Uruk had a face, and that face, legend insists, belonged to a man named Gilgamesh. Before kings, the temples ruled. The gods were landlords, priests their managers. Every harvest, every brick, every breath was owed upward to the heavens. But bureaucracy, like any living thing, eventually spawned rebellion. As Uruk's population swelled, so did the complexity of its problems. Floods needed rapid response, wars demanded strategy, and the people, tired of being managed by committees of the divine, wanted someone who could act. Out of that weariness was born a new idea, that one extraordinary individual could stand between gods and mortals, wielding both earthly authority and celestial favor. Thus, the first kingship descended from heaven, as the old Sumerian scribes liked to say. And when it landed in Uruk, it found its most famous expression in the semi-mythical Gilgamesh, a ruler who would later stride across the boundaries between history and legend like a man between worlds. The tablets that mention him are maddeningly fragmentary. Some call him the fifth king of Uruk. Others credit him with building its monumental walls. One text, the Sumerian king list, grants him a reign of 126 years, because why stop at reality when you can have poetry? Whatever the truth, archaeology agrees on this much. During the early dynastic period, Uruk entered its heroic age. Its rulers buried themselves like gods, built on a scale meant to defy time, and left behind the first human attempt to define what kingship meant. The royal cemetery of Uruk unearthed millennia later, tells their story in brick and gold. Among its tombs, archaeologists found rich burials filled with weapons jewelry and ceremonial objects, evidence of a ruling class convinced that death was merely a change of office. One tomb contained a golden helmet shaped like a human head inlaid with lapis and carnelian. Another, a lyre adorned with a bull's head of gleaming silver. There were cups of polished stone, ornate daggers, chariots carved from wood and shell. The message was unmistakable. Kings did not die, they ascended. It was in this glittering, perilous world that the legend of Gilgamesh took shape. The historical king, if he existed, was probably a conqueror, a builder, and perhaps, as one tablet hints, a rather exhausting boss. But the Gilgamesh, who lived in the imagination of his people, was something more half divine, half mortal, doomed to struggle with the limits of both. The stories written about him centuries later, the oldest surviving epic in the world, were not simple hero tales. They were meditations on the human condition, born from a civilization mature enough to ask what it meant to be alive. In the epic, Gilgamesh begins as a tyrant. He overworks his people, takes what he wants, and brooks no opposition. The citizens cry out to the gods, who respond not with thunder, but with balance. They create Enkidu, a wild man, from the steppe to humble the king. The two fight, become friends, and together embark on adventures, slaying monsters, defying the heavens, seeking immortality. But when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is left shattered, wandering the earth in search of the secret of eternal life. He finds only wisdom, that to be human is to build, to love, to die, and that the only immortality worth seeking is the legacy we leave behind. For all its mythic trappings, the epic mirrors the real transformations of Uruk's age. It's no coincidence that Gilgamesh's triumphs are all acts of construction and exploration. The text opens with him boasting of his city's great walls that archaeologists have indeed traced, stretching more than 9 kilometers around ancient Uruk. Those bricks, each one stamped with royal marks, were not mere fortifications. They were ideology in architecture, the physical embodiment of kingship. A city that once belonged to the gods now bore the signature of a man. Inside those walls, Uruk thrived as never before. The early dynastic kings organized labor on an unprecedented scale. Canals were expanded, new temples rose beside old ones, and the workshops grew busier than ever. Soldiers drilled in the courtyards, ready to defend the city or march against its rivals. The scribe's stylus, once a priestly tool, became a weapon of administration. Bureaucracy had learned to serve the crown, but kingship brought new dangers. With divine rulers came divine wars. The other Sumerian cities, Ur-Lagash, Umma, were no longer content to send tribute. They wanted autonomy and water. The great irrigation canals that sustained the southern plains were lifelines, and every city wanted control of them. The first recorded border disputes in history, complete with boundary stones and legal texts, appear from this era. The battlefields were not heroic plains, but muddy dikes and flooded fields where men fought with bronze-tipped spears over who owned the water that fed their gods. Through all this, the legend of Gilgamesh grew. In later centuries, scribes would copy and embellish his story until it became the world's first masterpiece of literature. But its roots were planted in the soil of early dynastic Uruk, among the builders and dreamers who turned their ruler into myth. To them, Gilgamesh wasn't just a man. He was civilization, personified, flawed, restless, ambitious mortal, yet reaching endlessly upward. Perhaps that's why his story survived when so many others crumbled into dust. In him, the people of Uruk saw themselves city builders, defying nature, merchants, chasing distant horizons, lovers of life, haunted by its brevity. When the epic's final lines invite us to climb the city's walls and look upon its foundations, They are more than poetry. They are archaeology written in verse. Go up Urshanabi, walk on the walls of Uruk. Inspect the base terrace, examine the brickwork. Is it not of burnt brick and good? The seven sages themselves laid its foundations. It's an extraordinary ending. The hero fails to find immortality, yet his city achieves it for him. The bricks are his legacy, the writing his echo. And as we millennia later read those words carved into tablets of the same clay that once paved Uruk's streets, we are reminded that the city itself did win the only kind of immortality that matters, the kind you can still touch. Stand on the top of Uruk's walls, and you would understand why Gilgamesh's scribes made them the closing image of the world's first great epic. They weren't just defensive structures, they were philosophy in brick. 9 kilometers of perfectly laid mud brick and fired brick, rising high above the plains, wide enough for chariots to race side by side. To the north and south, the rivers shimmered like veins of silver. To the east, the desert glowed gold in the morning light. And all around, the hum of life markets temples, children laughing, donkeys braying. To the people below, the walls weren't merely walls. They were proof that humanity could outbuild chaos. If the ziggurat was Uruk's soul, the walls were its skin, tough, proud, and meant to last. The Sumerians believed the gods had shaped the world from clay, and here their descendants returned the favor-molding clay into eternity. The very act of stacking bricks one atop another became a prayer of defiance. The flood may come, the sands may rise, but the city will endure. Yet the walls also whispered another truth, one that Gilgamesh himself would eventually confront, that no matter how high you build, time always climbs higher. It's easy to romanticize those walls now, but maintaining them was a nightmare. Thousands of workers labored under the sun, mixing clay, hauling water, shaping bricks in molds, drying them in great fields, before carrying them one by one up scaffolds of wood and rope. Every few years, floods eroded the lower courses, and the city had to rebuild. It was endless, exhausting, sacred labor, the kind of repetition that built not only cities, but civilizations. Inside the city, life reflected the same rhythm of creation and decay. The temples pulsed with offerings. The canals shimmered with trade boats. Markets bustled with shouting vendors, each hawking their share of barley wool or fish. Musicians played in the courtyards of nobles, while farmers trudged in from the fields, covered in dust and pride. It was a city of contrasts, divine order in the temples, human chaos in the streets, and the walls kept it all contained like a heartbeat inside a ribcage. But there was something else. Those walls contained fear. Every civilization that grows large enough begins to feel its own fragility. For Uruk, surrounded by rival city-states and the endless unpredictability of rivers and weather, fear was the shadow behind every triumph. The walls weren't built only to keep enemies out. They were built to convince the people inside that their world was safe, permanent, chosen. When Gilgamesh looked upon them, perhaps he believed that if the city could stand forever, so could he. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells us that after the death of his friend Enkidu, the great king left Uruk in despair. He wandered the deserts and mountains, seeking immortality, only to find it mocked at every turn. The gods, in their wisdom or cruelty, had reserved eternal life for themselves. Humanity, they said, was meant to build, to love, to die, and to be remembered. It's a haunting insight, and it feels almost autobiographical. The people of Uruk had already begun building monuments that would outlast generations. Every fired brick bore the king's name. Every ziggurat, every temple, every canal was inscribed with dedications. The message was clear. The gods are eternal, but so perhaps are we. The Sumerians had invented both writing and anxiety, and they used the former to manage the latter. To walk through the city in this age was to feel the weight of ambition everywhere. The temples glowed with imported lapis and gold leaf. The royal archives grew heavier each year, with tablets describing conquests, festivals, and decrees. The workshops produced art of breathtaking sophistication jewelry, shaped like celestial symbols, sculptures with eyes wide and luminous as the stars they worshipped. Even ordinary houses bore marks of refinement pottery, stamped with fine seals doorways framed in geometric patterns. Uruk was not just a city, it was a statement. The citizens must have sensed it too, that they were living in the center of something eternal. The festivals grew ever grander. Once a year, the sacred marriage rite between the king and the priestess of Inanna was performed atop the temple. It wasn't merely symbolic, it was theological theater. The union of human and divine was what kept the cosmos running. The king, embodying Dumuzi, the shepherd god, mated ritually with the goddess through her priestess, ensuring fertility for the land and legitimacy for the throne. The crowds below would cheer as music filled the night air, torches flickering like stars. The people didn't see politics, they saw renewal. But behind the ritual splendor, something subtle had changed. The kings of Uruk were no longer just servants of the gods, they were starting to compete with them. The divine marriage became less a submission than a partnership, and eventually a rivalry. The more powerful the kings grew, the more they wanted to be remembered not merely as rulers, but as demigods. It was no longer enough to serve the divine order. They wanted to become its architects. This was both the glory and the peril of Uruk. A city born from faith was learning the intoxicating taste of self-determination. The very innovations that made it flourish, writing architecture governance, had also made it restless. Humanity, once content to build for the gods, now built for itself. And perhaps that's why the story of Gilgamesh resonates so deeply even now. It's not just a tale of a man seeking immortality. It's the story of civilization, realizing it's mortal. The city's walls might endure for centuries, its kings' names might be pressed into clay, but time remains undefeated. Every triumph would one day crumble back into the same mud from which it was made. Still, for all that melancholy, there's beauty in Uruk's defiance. The people knew the flood would come again. They knew the walls would need rebuilding, the temples re-erecting. And yet, every dawn, they rose to do it anyway. Each generation inherited the work of the last and added its own layer, one brick higher toward heaven. Standing atop the ziggurat at twilight, Gilgamesh, or any king after him, would have seen the light fading across the endless plain, the canals glinting like threads of molten gold, the fields whispering in the wind. Below, the voices of thousands carried upward the chatter of children, the hammer of craftsmen, the songs of women grinding grain. That sound, the collective heartbeat of Uruk, was immortality in its purest form. When the epic closes with the command, "Go up on the wall of Uruk and read the tablet that tells of him," it's an invitation not to worship Gilgamesh, but to understand what he finally did. That immortality is not living forever, but being remembered for what you've built. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BC, the once unquestioned glory of Uruk found itself facing an uncomfortable truth: it was no longer alone. Across the same fertile plain that had nurtured its rise, other cities had learned its secrets. Ur-Lagash, Kish, all gleaming with their own ziggurats and bustling markets, had grown up like siblings, competing for the same inheritance. The cradle of civilization had become a crowded nursery, and the children were not good at sharing. The landscape of southern Mesopotamia was both a gift and a curse. The rivers fed life, but they also shifted unpredictably, snaking across the plain and demanding constant attention. Every city depended on irrigation canals that crisscrossed the delta like veins, and every canal began somewhere and ended somewhere else. Whoever controlled the headwaters controlled the harvest, and therefore the gods' favor. In a land where food was faith, and faith was power, water was everything. At first, disputes were settled through diplomacy and divine appeals. Priests from neighboring cities would meet reciting ritual oaths before the gods may Enlil judge between us. But faith is a fragile dam against hunger. When a city like Umma diverted more water than its allotment, the crops of Lagash withered, and soon the irrigation ditches ran red. These were not wars of grand strategy or conquest, but of mud and desperation, fought knee-deep in the very canals that fed civilization. Clay tablets from this era record grievances in excruciating detail, accusations of canal breaches, stolen fields, and boundary markers moved by stealth in the night. One scribe from Lagash, indignant beyond belief, recorded a curse on Umma's leaders that reads less like theology and more like bureaucratic rage. May their plows rust and their barley rot in the furrow. Still, from this muddy chaos, something extraordinary emerged. For the first time in human history, organized armies began to form, not mobs of farmers defending their fields, but professional soldiers trained, equipped, and paid by the temple or the palace. The kings of Uruk and its rivals turned their workshops from tools of trade to factories of war. Bronze spearheads and socketed axes rolled off the same production lines that once made plowshares. Standardized helmets, shields, and uniforms appeared stamped with emblems of patron gods. The logic of administration had found a new outlet: logistics. A typical battle in this age was small by later standards, perhaps a few thousand men, but it was no less terrifying. Infantry advanced in tight formations, shields overlapping spears, bristling drums beating to keep the rhythm. The clash was personal, brutal, and brief. Victory went not to the strongest, but to the best organized. The same minds that had engineered canals now engineered campaigns, timing attacks with flood seasons, moving supplies by river, and documenting every expense on clay tablets. Even in war, the bureaucracy marched first. Uruk, though still magnificent, began to lose its monopoly on innovation. Other cities matched its splendor, and some surpassed it. Ur to the south built grander harbors. Lagash developed its own administrative schools. Kish, in the north, claimed divine right as king of all lands. The Sumerians had entered their classical age, a patchwork of independent city-states, each a micro-kingdom with its own god's dialect and ambitions. Trade and warfare became twin forces, alternating like the dry and flood seasons. Within Uruk itself, the old order shifted again. Kingship had become hereditary, and the temple administrators, who once ruled by consensus, now served as royal ministers. The scribes, ever pragmatic, adjusted their records accordingly. Fewer offerings to the gods, more inventories of weapons, rations, and war booty. The great ziggurat still towered, but beside it rose barracks and armories. Civilization had found a new purpose: competition. This rivalry produced astonishing progress. To fund wars and temple projects, rulers demanded precise accounting. Mathematics, once used for barley tallies, grew sophisticated enough for geometry and astronomy. Calendars were standardized to time campaigns and festivals alike. Diplomacy took written form letters between rulers, sealed with intricate cylinders, the first international correspondence. One tablet from Kish even includes what might be the earliest peace treaty and agreement carved in clay and sanctified by shared gods. But for every alliance, there was betrayal. The chronicles tell of the endless cycle. Lagash defeats Umma. Umma retaliates. Intervenes. And somewhere in the middle, a scribe records it all with weary professionalism. The gods themselves seemed exhausted. Temples were rebuilt, sacked, and rebuilt again. And yet, through all this strife, civilization did not collapse. It adapted. Conflict, paradoxically, made the Sumerians sharper, more inventive, more connected. Archaeologists have even found evidence of the world's first arms control dispute. A boundary inscription, known as the Stele of the Vultures, depicts King Eannatum of Lagash marching over his enemies. His soldiers, arrayed in disciplined rows, their long spears glinting in stylized symmetry. It's propaganda, carved in limestone, but it reveals something profound, the birth of collective identity. These were no longer tribes or clans, they were citizens of states. Their loyalty belonged not just to a ruler, but to a place, a name, a symbol. Uruk watched all this with both pride and anxiety. It was the teacher, watching its students surpass it, the elder statesman of a restless generation. Though its influence remained immense, its borders shrank. Trade routes shifted. River channels changed course. The center of gravity was moving south toward Ur and Lagash. Yet Uruk's prestige never faded completely. Its kings traced their ancestry to Gilgamesh. Its scribes were still sought after. Its temples remained sacred ground. In a way, Uruk had become more than a city. It had become an idea, a myth of origin that every new ruler wanted to inherit. Still, one can imagine the discontent simmering in the city's narrow alleys. Taxes grew heavier. Conscription drained the workforce, and the once open fields were now marked with the scars of forgotten battles. The priests preached unity, the kings promised victory, but the ordinary people likely longed for the simpler age when the only wars were against the floods. History rarely grants such mercy twice. And yet, amid the blood and bureaucracy, something magnificent was happening. The Sumerians were forging the first political map of humanity. They were experimenting, sometimes disastrously, with how to share power, manage resources, and balance faith with authority. Their quarrels would become templates for every kingdom and republic to follow. They were learning that civilization, like irrigation, works only when the channels are maintained, and that even then it sometimes overflows. As dusk settled over the plain, a traveler approaching from the north might have seen the fires of many cities flickering across the horizon, each glow a heartbeat of human ambition. Uruk's light still burned brightest, but others were catching up their own ziggurats, reaching for the same indifferent stars. And so, the land between the rivers entered its age of rivalry, an orchestra of cities, playing in both harmony and discord, their melodies sometimes beautiful, sometimes catastrophic, but together composing the next movement of history. If the walls of Uruk were its body and its archives its mind, then the temples were its soul, burning perfumed and eternal. Every dawn, as the sun rose over the reed marshes and gilded the ziggurats' terraces, the city awakened not to the crowing of roosters, but to the call of ritual. Priests ascended the stairways, musicians tuned their lyres, and the scent of incense floated over the rooftops. The gods had to be fed before anyone else could eat. In Uruk, religion wasn't a pastime, it was the central engine of existence. Two deities towered above all others: Anu, the Sky Father, distant and serene, and Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, goddess of love and war, fertility and chaos. Between them stretched the full spectrum of human life order, above desire below. Their temples dominated the city's sacred precincts, the Eanna House of Heaven for Inanna, and the towering white temple atop the Anu ziggurat. Together, they were the twin poles around which Uruk's universe spun. The temple of Anu was austere, its walls gleaming with white plaster that caught the sunlight like polished bone. Priests climbed its staircases to make offerings of beer and bred their prayers rising into the open sky. There were no idols within. Anu was too vast, too abstract to be contained in human form. His presence was felt in the stillness of the air, in the stars that wheeled overhead. The temple's high terraces were both observatory and altar. From here, priests tracked the movements of Venus and Jupiter, charting the gods' invisible moods. Astronomy, that great marriage of science and faith, was born on this roof. But if Anu's temple represented order, Inanna's was its dazzling opposite, vibrant, sensual, unpredictable. The Iyana district was a city within the city, a maze of courtyard shrines, workshops, and storerooms. Here, sculptors carved statues of the goddess from alabaster and lapis. Perfumers brewed oils and incense. Weavers dyed garments in colors so vivid that later poets claimed they were made from captured sunsets. The temple wasn't just a house of worship. It was a cultural factory, a place where art, music, and myth mingled freely. And at its heart stood the goddess herself, Inanna radiant and terrifying, draped in gold, her eyes wide with the knowing gaze of eternity. She was love and lust battle, and justice the womb and the storm. To some she was the compassionate mother, to others the devourer of kings. Her moods could change the fate of cities. When her priests sang her hymns, they did so carefully, for flattery could save a nation, but one misplaced word could doom it. Inanna's cult was unlike any other in the ancient world. Her priesthood included both men and women, and sometimes those who blurred the line entirely. The goddess of duality, she welcomed contradictions, male priests who donned feminine garments, women who took up the roles of warriors or administrators. To serve Inanna was to step outside the ordinary, to live in her shimmering liminal space where order and chaos embraced. Later myths would remember her as the goddess who descended into the underworld and rose again, defying death itself. But here in Uruk, she was alive every day, in every feast and storm and seduction. The rituals that honored her were spectacular. During the Great Spring Festival, the streets filled with music dancers and processions of sacred statues carried on the shoulders of priests. The temple gates opened to reveal the statue of Inanna, shining with inlaid jewels and fragrant oils. The people cheered, throwing flowers, chanting her many names: Queen of Heaven, Lady of the Date Palms, Bringer of Life. The festival reached its climax with the sacred marriage, the ritual union of the king and the high priestess, embodying Dumuzi, the shepherd god, and Inanna herself. The act, performed in secrecy atop the temple, was said to renew the fertility of the land for another year. To modern ears, it sounds mythic symbolic. But for the citizens of Uruk, it was deadly serious. The king's power depended on it. His legitimacy was not inherited through bloodline alone, but renewed through divine favor. If the crops failed, it meant the gods had turned away. If the floods came too early, perhaps the sacred marriage had been imperfect. The city's prosperity, its very survival, was tied to ritual performance. In a way, Uruk itself was a temple disguised as a metropolis. Inside these temples, the division between sacred and mundane dissolved. The same spaces where priests prayed were also where scribes kept ledgers, cooks prepared offerings, and artisans worked. The temple complexes functioned like the central banks of their time, holding vast stores of grain, silver, and trade goods. Every sacrifice, every donation was meticulously recorded. When someone paid tribute to the gods, it was a transaction in every sense. Religion and economics had become one and the same. Yet amid this bureaucratic devotion, there was genuine spirituality. The hymns to Inanna, written in cuneiform on delicate tablets, are breathtaking even now, sensual, poetic, and unapologetically human. One fragment reads, "My Lady radiant as the rising moon." Your beauty stirs the hearts of gods and men alike. You lift the weak to glory and cast down the proud in the dust. These were not empty flattery. They were art. The priests of Uruk were poets, philosophers, scientists, and administrators rolled into one. In serving their goddess, they invented literature itself. And perhaps it's fitting that Inanna, goddess of paradox, presided over the first flowering of human creativity. Her temple's influence reached beyond Uruk's borders, spreading hymns and myths that would echo through Babylon, Assyria, and even Greece. Aphrodite, Ishtar, Venus, all were her later reflections. The language of devotion, born here in the Iana, would shape how humanity spoke to its gods forever. But faith, like empire, is never static. The more magnificent Uruk's temples grew, the more they demanded. Offerings multiplied, festivals expanded, priests rose in rank. The city's wealth poured into the heavens, and in return came both blessing and strain. Somewhere in those incense clouds, bureaucracy met belief in a dance both sacred and absurd, a divine spreadsheet balancing souls against barley. Uruk, the city of Anu and Inanna, had built not only the first temples, but the first dreams of transcendence, the belief that humans could touch the divine, not by leaving the world, but by shaping it. It was inevitable that someone would look upon the riches of Sumer, the ziggurats gleaming in the sun, the canals bursting with grain, the cities rising like islands from the floodplain, and feel a dangerous thought bloom in his chest. All this could be mine. Around 2334 BC, that thought had a name: Sargon of Akkad. The Sumerians were the builders of civilization, but they were not its unifiers. For centuries, their cities had lived like quarreling siblings, each with its own gods, rulers, and grudges. Uruk, Ur-Lagash, Umma, Kish. Each shining, each proud, each convinced it was the true center of the world. Their rivalries produced art, science, and innovation, but also endless wars over canals, borders, and divine prestige. Into this divided landscape strode Sargon, a man from the north, a foreigner with ambition so vast it made the gods themselves uneasy. Sargon was not born a king. According to legend, he began life as a gardener's son, abandoned as an infant, and set adrift in a basket on the Euphrates. Sound familiar? It's a story later borrowed by others from Moses to Romulus. He was rescued and raised by humble folk, eventually rising through the ranks as a cupbearer in the court of Kish. But ambition is a seed that never stays buried. Sargon overthrew. His master seized the throne and set his sights south toward the fertile plains of Sumer. Uruk was among his first targets. By then the city was ancient, even by Sargon's time, glorious, wealthy, and weighed down by its own traditions. Its priests still ruled in the name of Inanna, its kings claimed descent from Gilgamesh, and its archives overflowed with tablets proclaiming divine order. Sargon looked at all that order and saw opportunity. The chronicles say he marched with a disciplined army of thousands, wielding bronze weapons and the revolutionary innovation of the composite bow. His soldiers were not conscripts bound by duty to temple or city. They were professionals, loyal only to him. Where Sumerian armies had been led by councils of priests, Sargon's forces followed a single will. That was his true weapon, not bronze or strategy, but unity. When his troops reached Uruk's great walls, the city must have trembled. Those very walls that Gilgamesh had built to defy time now faced a mortal threat. We don't know the details of the siege, only that it ended inevitably with the gates falling. Perhaps it was starvation. Perhaps betrayal. Perhaps the city's defenders, exhausted by centuries of rivalry, simply could not summon the strength to resist another war. What we do know is that Uruk fell, and with it fell the independence of Sumer. Sargon's conquest swept through the region like a sandstorm, City after city submitted their temples spared. If they pledged loyalty, their gods permitted to keep their shrines, but forced to kneel beside his own. He founded a new capital, Akkad, whose exact location is still lost to us, and from there he forged the world's first empire. For the first time, the land between the rivers was united under a single ruler. To the people of Uruk, it must have felt like the end of the world, or at least the end of their world. The proud scribes who once wrote hymns to Inanna now recorded tributes for Akkadian overseers. The statues of local kings were replaced with those of Sargon, whose inscriptions thundered with new rhetoric, not of priestly stewardship, but of conquest. One surviving text, likely copied in Uruk's own scriptoria, boasts, "Sargon, king of the universe, subdued the 4 quarters of the earth." Modesty apparently was not his strong suit. Yet even as Sargon imposed his empire, he didn't destroy Sumerian culture. He absorbed it. The Akkadian language, written in the same cuneiform script, borrowed heavily from Sumerian vocabulary. The old myths and hymns were recopied, translated, preserved. Sargon even honored Inanna, claiming her as his divine patroness. He presented himself not as the destroyer of Sumer, but as its heir, the man destined to perfect what the city-states had begun. Still, the reality was far less harmonious. Beneath the veneer of unity, resentment simmered. The Sumerians had built their civilization on cooperation ritual and local autonomy. The Akkadians ruled through hierarchy and force. Governors appointed by Sargon replaced elected councils. Taxes flowed north to Akkad, and with them, the lifeblood of the southern cities. The temple economies that had once managed their own affairs were now audited by imperial scribes. Bureaucracy had survived, but it had changed masters. Uruk endured this transformation with the weary grace of an old scholar watching his students rewrite the lesson. Its ziggurats remained centers of worship. Its scribes still copied the hymns of Inanna and Anu. But something in the city's soul had shifted. The gods, once intimate patrons of each neighborhood, now seemed distant. The festivals continued. The music still echoed through the courtyards, but the joy was muted. The people had become subjects of an empire, their voices recorded in a language that was no longer quite their own. And yet, paradoxically, the Akkadian conquest also carried Sumer's legacy farther than Uruk could have imagined. Sargon's empire linked the Mesopotamian heartland to the mountains of Iran, the forests of Anatolia, the Levantine coast. Trade flourished. Cuneiform spread. Sumerian mathematics and law were transmitted across the empire's network of scribal schools. It was through conquest, not peace, that the ideas born in Uruk reached the wider world. For the first time, humanity witnessed both the glory and the curse of empire. The same organizational genius that once managed canals and temple granaries was now managing armies and provinces. The machinery of civilization had learned to serve power instead of community. And in doing so, it revealed its dual nature order and oppression, prosperity, and pain. Sargon ruled for decades. His inscriptions speak of triumphs, rebellions crushed, and tributes pouring in from distant lands. But empires, like kings, do not last forever. After his death, his descendants struggled to hold the realm together. Rebellions flared. Cities once proud of their obedience remembered their independence. Uruk, patient and stubborn, waited. When the Akkadian Empire finally collapsed around 2150 BC, undone by drought invasion and internal decay, Uruk was still standing. Battered, yes, but breathing. The city that had survived flood and famine had outlasted even the world's first empire. Its walls, rebuilt again and again, seemed almost to smirk at time itself. When the storm of Akkad finally blew itself out, the land between the rivers lay exhausted. The great empire had collapsed like a sandcastle at high tide, washed away by drought rebellion, and the strange new invaders, known as the Gudians, mountain tribes, who swept down from the northeast, plundering what was left of Sargon's realm. For nearly a century, Mesopotamia fell into chaos. Canals silted up trade routes, broke temples stood abandoned. To the Sumerians, it must have seemed as if the gods had turned their faces away. And yet even ruin has its rhythms. In time, the waters receded, and from the mud rose a familiar pattern. Cities stirred again, Ur-Lagash, and yes, Uruk. From these survivors came a renaissance so thorough, so astonishingly organized that later scholars would call it a restoration of order. The name history gave to this new age was the third dynasty of Ur-Ur III, for short, and it became the last great flowering of the Sumerian world. The man who rebuilt it all was Ur-Nammu, founder of the dynasty around 2112 BC. Unlike Sargon's empire of swords, Ur-Nammu's was an empire of styluses. His genius wasn't in conquest, but in coordination. Where the Akkadians had ruled through fear, he ruled through paperwork. In his world, every harvest, every conscription, every temple repair was written down, stamped, and archived. It was civilization as spreadsheet, and it worked beautifully. Uruk, though no longer the political capital, remained one of the empire's administrative jewels. The city's scribes, steeped in millennia of habit, adapted easily to the new system. They filled their tablets with neat lines of Sumerian cuneiform, by now a language of scholars and ceremony, spoken fluently only in temples and schools. Every loaf of bread, baked for the temple kitchens, every ration of beer paid to a worker was recorded with near-religious precision. Modern historians have nicknamed this period the bureaucratic dream, but from the perspective of the workers, it might have felt more like the bureaucratic nightmare. Picture an overseer in Uruk's granaries shouting numbers as scribes tally the harvest. 75 baskets of barley from the east field. The reed stylus scratches the figure into wet clay. Another scribe checks the total seals, the tablet files it in the archive. Multiply this scene by thousands, and you get the rhythm of Ur-3. The empire wasn't held together by armies. It was held together by accountants. Still, there was a grandeur to it all. The kings of Ur styled themselves as shepherds of the people chosen by the gods to restore cosmic balance. Ur-Nammu himself issued what may be the world's first written law code, predating Hammurabi's by centuries. Its fragments speak of fairness and proportional justice fines instead of mutilation, compensation instead of vengeance. Civilization, having invented the lawsuit long ago, was now trying to invent mercy. Under his son Shulgi, the system reached its dazzling peak. Shulgi ruled for nearly half a century, and if his inscriptions are to be believed, and they rarely are modest, he was a polymath warrior, scholar-athlete, and patron of the arts. He claimed to run long distances without tiring, and to read every tablet in his archives. Whether or not he actually did, either the propaganda worked. His reign transformed Sumer into a single humming administrative machine. Uruk prospered as one of its key nodes. The ziggurat was repaired yet again, its white plaster gleaming under the sun. Temples were restored, workshops revived, and canals cleared. Traders once more guided their boats along the Euphrates, carrying copper from Oman timber, from Lebanon, and luxury goods from as far away as Afghanistan. The scribes of Uruk produced thousands of tablets, some listing temple employees, cooks, singers, brewers, accountants, others recording the empire's logistics with obsessive care. We know the exact rations given to bricklayers on canal projects, down to the liter of beer and the loaf of bread per man. The detail would impress a modern HR department. But behind the neat order cracks were forming. The Ur-3 empire relied on a rigid hierarchy that funneled wealth upward. Peasants owed labor service to the state digging canals, hauling bricks, harvesting crops. Merchants handled trade, but profits were skimmed by royal agents. The scribes, the only ones who truly understood the paperwork, became an elite unto themselves. A single miscalculated tax, a missed delivery, or a lost tablet could trigger audits that made entire families destitute. Civilization had perfected not just management, but red tape. And yet for a while, it seemed to work. The empire's cities glowed again. Uruk's streets bustled with officials in fine linen robes, children heading to scribal schools, and traders bartering under the temple porticos. The schools of Uruk the Adubas trained the next generation of bureaucrats in reading, writing, mathematics, and ethics. Their homework tablets have survived exercises in Sumerian grammar multiplication tables and proverbs such as, "The poor man's mouth smells bad to his superior." Education, it seems, was as humbling then as now. In the temples, rituals continued with new precision. The priests of Inanna kept calendars so accurate that festivals matched the cycles of Venus, her sacred planet. Offerings were scheduled down to the day, ensuring that no god went hungry for lack of attention or inventory. Religion had become another branch of accounting, yet it still inspired awe. When night fell, torches flickered along the ziggurat steps, and the chants of priests drifted through the city like the echo of eternity. But empires, no matter how well documented, cannot escape entropy. By the final century of Ur III, the climate turned harsher. Harvests faltered. The bureaucracy, once nimble, ossified under its own weight. Tablets multiplied faster than solutions. Provinces rebelled. The Amorites pressed from the west, the Elamites from the east. In one heartbreaking inscription, a weary administrator laments, "The grain is short, the laborers flee. The scribes weep at their empty tablets." It is the sound of a civilization, realizing it has become too heavy for its own hands. Around 2004 BC, the Elamites marched on Ur, looting its temples and carrying off its king in chains. The great empire of paperwork was gone, but Uruk, ever stubborn, endured again. Though diminished, it remained a city of learning and faith. Its scribes preserved the old Sumerian texts, even as new rulers spoke Akkadian. In the centuries that followed, those same texts would be copied and recopied, becoming the bedrock of Mesopotamian culture. And so, the cycle repeated: chaos, order, decay, rebirth. Uruk had seen it all before. The Gutians, the Akkadians, now the Elamites, each came like the flood and went like the flood. The clay dried, cracked, and was reshaped anew. Somewhere, perhaps, in the ruins of an old archive, a final scribe of Ur III pressed his stylus into the wet clay and sighed. He wrote the day's last entry: grain received, workers unpaid, and set the tablet to dry in the fading light. Behind him, the city's bells rang for evening prayers. The wind smelled of dust and baked earth. The record would survive. The empire would not. Yet the spirit of Uruk, the belief that knowledge, order, and memory could outlast kings, lived on. It was the city's oldest habit and its greatest defiance. Empires rise the way rivers flood, suddenly, irresistibly, and they fade the same way, leaving behind fertile ground for what comes next. When the last kings of Ur were dragged away by the Elamites, the land between the rivers did not vanish. It simply rearranged itself. Out of the political wreckage of the Ur III bureaucracy came new powers, new languages, and a city that would one day eclipse even Uruk in fame: Babylon. At first, Babylon was barely more than a provincial outpost, a modest settlement on the Euphrates under the rule of the Amorites, a Semitic people who had filtered into Mesopotamia from the west. They were newcomers, herders, and traders turned city dwellers who learned quickly to speak the language of the scribes and to pray to the gods of the land they adopted. The great temples of Sumer still loomed over the plains, and the old cities, Ur-Nippur Uruk, still commanded reverence, but their power was fading like a receding tide. Into that silence, Babylon began to speak. By the time Hammurabi took the throne in 1792, BC Uruk was already ancient beyond comprehension. Its people still worshipped Inanna and Anu. Its scribes still copied hymns in the old Sumerian tongue. But the world had changed. The language of daily life was now Akkadian, the lingua franca of empire. The Sumerian language lived on only in the temples and schools revered, but no longer spoken like Latin in a medieval monastery. Even so, the teachers of Uruk kept it alive with a zeal that bordered on devotion. Their students memorized not just words, but entire worlds. And they had plenty of time to study, for Uruk had become what it had always secretly wanted to be, a city of scholars. Freed from the constant jockeying of kings and governors, it turned inward, becoming a place of learning religion and quiet persistence. It was here that the great Sumerian myths were recopied, edited, and preserved, the stories of creation, of the flood, of Inanna's descent to the underworld. The epic of Gilgamesh itself, once a patchwork of Sumerian poems, was refined in Akkadian and given new life. In a way, Uruk had achieved its immortality. It had become the library of civilization. Meanwhile, Babylon rose like a reed after the rains. Hammurabi unified the patchwork of Amorite kingdoms through a blend of diplomacy, cunning, and warfare. His code of laws, inscribed on a basalt stele and written in cuneiform, echoed the spirit of Ur-Nammu's earlier code, but on a grander scale. It was justice turned into monument law as architecture. The famous line, that the strong may not oppress the weak, was less a social revolution than a public relations triumph. But it set a precedent. Rulers justified their power not only by conquest, but by order. Uruk, for its part, adjusted. It had learned long ago that survival meant cooperation. Its temples served as regional centers for Babylonian administration. Priests in the service of Marduk, Babylon's rising god, corresponded with the old priesthood of Anu and Inanna, ensuring that the divine bureaucracy continued to run smoothly. When caravans brought taxes of silver and barley from the countryside, scribes still recorded every measure on clay. The symbols had evolved, but the rhythm was eternal. Daily life in Uruk during this time must have felt both familiar and transformed. The city's ancient quarters still followed the same grid of streets that had been laid down 1,000 years earlier. The ziggurat still dominated the skyline, though its bricks were patched and repaired countless times. Merchants sold textiles, oil, and pottery. Fishermen cast nets along the canals. Children learned their letters by copying old proverbs, some of which were already 2,000 years old. Imagine a schoolboy sitting in a dusty courtyard, scratching into clay the words, "Do not neglect your God, or your teacher will strike you." Civilization has always known how to motivate students. Yet for all its continuity, Uruk now lived in Babylon's shadow. The trade routes that once centered on Sumer had shifted northward. The Euphrates changed course. The sea crept farther south. The lifeblood of empire flowed elsewhere. Uruk endured through faith and habit, not power. But sometimes endurance is its own kind of victory. The city that once taught the world to write now became its quiet memory keeper. The Babylonian period was one of refinement rather than invention. Science, mathematics, and literature matured into recognizable forms. Astronomers in Uruk charted the skies with a precision that would astonish later Greeks. They recorded eclipses, predicted planetary movements, and treated the heavens as both calendar and code. The old sky god Anu still had his priests, now joined by Marduk's astronomers and Nanna's lunar watchers. At night, the rooftops of Uruk shimmered with oil lamps as scholars gazed upward, tracing the fates of gods and kings written in starlight. Meanwhile, mathematicians developed systems for dividing circles into 360 degrees and hours into 60 minutes concepts that still govern our sense of time. Every tick of your modern clock is a faint echo of Uruk's legacy carried through Babylon's scribal schools and into eternity. Art and language flourished too. Cuneiform script reached its most elegant form, with graceful flowing wedges carved by expert hands. The old hymns to Inanna were recopied alongside new hymns to Marduk and Ishtar, her Babylonian name. In one text, a priest from Uruk prays, Lady of Battle and Mercy, who lifts the scepter, and the plow, alike you have made, kings tremble, and the harvest rejoice. Even as empires changed and gods traded places, the voice of Uruk still sang beneath it all. By Hammurabi's death in 1750, BC Babylon had unified Mesopotamia into a single glittering civilization, but like every empire before it, it was already sowing the seeds of decline. Floods, rebellion, and shifting alliances slowly eroded its power, yet Uruk remained quietly unshaken. When invaders came, they found not a city of warriors, but of scribes, and scribes are harder to conquer than armies, for they wage their wars in memory. In the centuries that followed, Uruk would see rulers come and go, Kassites, Assyrians, Elamites, Chaldeans. Each left inscriptions, rebuilt temples, renamed gods, and moved on. And still, the scribes of Uruk kept writing, copying, and cataloging. They served whoever ruled, but worshipped only continuity. It's tempting to see Uruk in these centuries as diminished, a relic, a ghost of its former self. But that would be like calling an oak tree diminished, because it has stopped growing taller. The city had matured into something subtler, a keeper of wisdom. It had moved from creation to curation. It was no longer the restless youth of civilization, it was its archivist. Time is a patient sculptor. By the first millennium, BC Uruk was no longer the radiant center of the world, but an aging monument to its own past, a city that remembered more than it ruled. Its clay archives had become its true citadel. Yet history, in one of its small ironies, was about to give the ancient city another act. The great powers of the north, the Assyrians, were rising, and though they built their capitals in places like Nineveh and Nimrud, they looked to the southern cities for legitimacy. For scholars, for priests, for meaning, for memory. When the Assyrians began consolidating their empire in the 900s, BC Uruk must have seemed like a ghost from the age of myth. Its ziggurat was worn by centuries of wind and flood. Its canals had shifted course, but within its crumbling walls, something persisted. The temple still functioned. The old gods still received offerings, and a dwindling but stubborn class of scribes kept writing in cuneiform, the world's oldest continuous writing system, still alive after 3,000 years. The Assyrians, for all their reputation as brutal conquerors, had a scholar's respect for tradition. Their kings styled themselves not just as warriors, but as custodians of civilization. They sent expeditions south to collect ancient texts, statues, and rituals, believing that the favor of the gods lay hidden in the wisdom of Sumer. One king, Ashurbanipal, whose library in Nineveh would one day astonish archaeologists, ordered his scribes to copy the oldest stories they could find. Where did they go to find them? To Uruk. The priests of Uruk must have received these northern visitors with a mixture of pride and melancholy. Here were men who called themselves kings of the world, bowing before clay tablets written by their own ancestors' ancestors. The scribes of Uruk, old and unhurried, likely explained the archaic signs to them, tracing the wedge marks with patient fingers. They were keepers of a knowledge so ancient it had become almost divine. The city itself began to change again under Assyrian influence. The temples were repaired. The cult of Anu was revived on a grand scale, paired with that of Ishtar, the evolved form of Inanna. The ziggurat rebuilt in gleaming white brick, rose once more above the plains. For the first time in centuries, Uruk felt the hum of construction, the clang of bronze tools, the dust of progress. It was no longer the capital of an empire, but it had become a spiritual capital, the cradle of civilization, reborn as a sanctuary of its own memory. The Assyrians admired spectacle. Their governors sponsored festivals at Uruk that rivaled those of old Sumer. During the New Year celebrations, statues of the gods were carried through the streets, accompanied by music, dance, and incense thick enough to make the air shimmer. The ceremonies were more theatrical than spiritual now, imperial propaganda disguised as piety, but for the people of Uruk, they must have stirred something deep. Beneath the layers of empire and empire again, the heartbeat of the old city pulsed. Life in Assyrian-era Uruk was a strange blend of ancient ritual and modern administration. The old scribal schools thrived again, now training clerks for imperial service. Tablets from this period, some found still stacked neatly in abandoned storerooms, record everything from temple repairs to beer deliveries. The handwriting is neat, but hurried the language and evolved Akkadian peppered with Sumerian words, whose meanings even the scribes no longer fully understood. They copied them anyway, because that's what you do with sacred things. You preserve them, even when their sense begins to fade. Uruk had become in effect a city of archives. The priests cataloged the gods' attributes as carefully as merchants tallied their goods. Astronomers on the temple terraces watched the skies not for omens of flood or war, but for patterns' predictability. They recorded eclipses, planetary movements, and equinoxes with astonishing precision. From these observations came the foundations of astrology and astronomy alike. Even the calendar you use today carries traces of their work, the division of the year into 12 months, the week into 7 days each day, named for a celestial body. But history has a cruel sense of timing. While Uruk was busy preserving the world's knowledge, the Assyrian Empire was busy overreaching itself. By the 600s, BC revolts and invasions gnawed at its edges. The Babylonians rose again under Nabopolassar, forming an alliance with the Medes to strike at Nineveh. When the Assyrian Empire finally fell in 612 BC, the shockwaves rolled down the Euphrates. Yet again, Uruk survived. It had seen too many empires come and go to mistake one for eternity. Under the Neo-Babylonian Empire that followed the city, entered another brief, glittering revival. The rulers of Babylon, most famously Nebuchadnezzar II, poured resources into restoring the old cities of Sumer as symbols of divine heritage. Uruk's temples were refurbished, its ziggurat replastered and painted in brilliant colors. The cult of Anu regained prominence perhaps for the last time, and new shrines were dedicated to Ishtar, whose worship by now had spread across the entire Near East. Imagine Uruk in this period, its avenues lined with palms, its walls freshly repaired, its temple facades covered in glazed brick, depicting lion stars and celestial patterns. Processions wound through the streets once more, carrying statues of the gods in chariots of gilded wood. The priests chanted hymns written 1,000 years earlier. The people sang them in words they barely understood, but the rhythm was timeless. It was also during this period that Uruk scholars reached new heights of scientific thought. They developed sophisticated mathematical tables, calculated planetary orbits, and invented methods for predicting eclipses that would influence Greek and later Islamic astronomy. Their observations were not purely mystical. They were data meticulously logged and refined over generations. The old ziggurat of Anu had become an observatory, its priests the first scientists in history. And yet, as the city's intellect soared, its population declined. The once crowded neighborhoods thinned, the old canals silted up the fields, beyond the walls fell to dust. Uruk was becoming what it would remain for the rest of its life, a temple city, sacred but peripheral. The world's first metropolis had turned into a shrine to its own endurance. Still, what an endurance it was. When Cyrus of Persia swept through Mesopotamia in 539 BC, taking Babylon with barely a fight, Uruk bowed gracefully and continued as before. Its priests offered sacrifices to the new king in the name of Anu and Ishtar. To the Persians, practical and tolerant, this was fine. The taxes were paid and the stars were observed. Civilization had become routine. But for those who lived there, those who still climbed the ziggurat stairs to greet the sunrise, who still pressed wedges into clay tablets, even as the world adopted parchment and ink, there must have been a bittersweet pride. The empires of Assyria and Babylon had come roaring like lions. Now they were gone, and the old city still stood quietly breathing its gods, watching from the terraces. In the ruins of Nineveh, archaeologists would one day find fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh preserved in Ashurbanipal's library. But those tablets were copies of copies, descendants of texts, first written by the hands of Uruk's scribes 3 millennia before. Even in defeat, the city had conquered time. The Assyrians had their palaces, the Babylonians their hanging gardens. Uruk had memory, and in the long ledger of history, memory is the only empire that never falls. By the 6th century, BC, Uruk should have been dust. The city was already older than legend, its ziggurat rebuilt more times than anyone could count, its gods renamed and reinterpreted in half a dozen languages. And yet, against all logic, it glittered again, reborn under the rule of Babylon's greatest king, Nebuchadnezzar II. If the Assyrians had celebrated Uruk's sacred ancestry, the Babylonians went further. They made it fashionable. To them, the ancient Sumerian cities were living proof that the gods had always favored Mesopotamia. Nebuchadnezzar, determined to restore the old glory of his realm, poured wealth into rebuilding temples from Ur to Nippur to Uruk. The project was both political and devotional. He didn't just want a functioning empire, he wanted to stand in the lineage of Gilgamesh and the first builders of civilization. In the center of Uruk rose the renewed Eanna temple complex, dedicated to Ishtar, the Babylonian evolution of Inanna, still the restless goddess of love, fertility, and war. Her cult had never truly disappeared. It had simply changed costumes. The new Eanna shimmered with imported stone and glazed bricks of cobalt blue and golden ochre. On its facades, lions and rosettes glowed beneath the desert sun, each symbol invoking her ferocity and beauty. The temple courtyards filled once more with processions of dancers, incense bearers, and priests whose chants echoed words first sung 2,000 years earlier. The Anu ziggurat, too, was given fresh life. Nebuchadnezzar's builders replastered its terraces, replacing eroded bricks with new ones stamped with his royal inscription, "For the life of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, faithful servant of Marduk, builder of temples for all the gods." It was the same boast that Uruk's earliest kings had made, rendered now in a new tongue, but with the same longing to be remembered in brick. At night, the ziggurat's upper shrine burned with lamplight, visible for miles across the plain, an ancient beacon relit. If you walked through Uruk in those years, you would have seen a strange mingling of the old and new. The city's avenues were lined with palm trees and rebuilt gates. Its canals flowed again, deepened for barge traffic. Babylonian administrators managed trade and taxes, but the scribes of Uruk still handled the records using cuneiform, so ancient that only they could truly read it. Their language, by now a ritual one learned like Latin in the cloisters of medieval Europe, was preserved in temple schools, where boys practiced copying hymns and star charts on clay. In one excavated classroom, archaeologists found a student's half-finished tablet, the first lines of the Epic of Gilgamesh, clumsily written but unmistakable. The story, had come home. Uruk's astronomers reached astonishing sophistication under the Neo-Babylonians. From the terrace of Anu's ziggurat, they observed the planets with mathematical precision, recording each movement in columns of numbers that still baffle modern scholars with their accuracy. They could predict eclipses, track Venus's phases, and even measure time in hours and minutes. To them, the sky was not merely divine, it was orderly. The gods, they decided, revealed their will not through whim, but through pattern. The heavens had become a text, and Uruk's scholars were its interpreters. Down below, the workshops hummed with life again. Goldsmiths hammered delicate offerings for the temples. Potters turned out fine vessels painted with celestial motifs. Traders from the Persian Gulf brought pearls and aromatics. From the Levant came cedarwood and wine. The markets of Uruk smelled of honey and bitumen smoke and spice. It must have felt for a brief shining moment like the golden ages of old, though now under a different flag, a different god. Religion had evolved too, yet the essence of the old faith endured. Marduk of Babylon was supreme, but Ishtar remained a force to be reckoned with. Her cult blended sensuality and sanctity in a way that bewildered foreign visitors. Greek travelers who later came through the region would write half in awe, half in scandal about priestesses who offered themselves to the goddess as acts of worship. In truth, the rituals were likely symbolic, deeply spiritual expressions of renewal, fertility, and cosmic balance. But to outsiders, it was one more example of the East's eternal mystery. For the citizens of Uruk, it was simply life as usual, devotion, commerce, bureaucracy, and hope. They were heirs to a tradition so old it had become instinct. When they pressed a seal into clay, they were repeating gestures their ancestors had made before the pyramids existed. When they poured oil before the statue of Ishtar, they were echoing prayers that had once called to Inanna beneath a younger moon. The Neo-Babylonian kings understood the power of such continuity. Nebuchadnezzar's empire was a mosaic of peoples: Babylonians, Chaldeans, Arameans, Persians, and the temples of the south bound them together through shared reverence for antiquity. Every restored ziggurat was a political statement. This is where civilization began, and it belongs to us now. Yet even as Uruk glittered, the horizon darkened. To the east, the Persians were stirring under the leadership of Cyrus the Great, a man with the same quiet ambition that had driven Sargon millennia earlier. His armies were disciplined, his diplomacy brilliant, his tolerance legendary. When he finally swept into Mesopotamia in 539 BC, conquering Babylon without bloodshed, the priests of Uruk must have watched anxiously from their terraces. But Cyrus surprised them. He did not plunder, he restored. The Persians were pragmatic conquerors. They recognized that the easiest way to rule an empire was to let each region keep its gods, its language, its customs. Uruk therefore continued, much as before, paying tribute but retaining its sacred prestige. The Persians built new roads and introduced standardized coinage, knitting the old Sumerian heartland into the arteries of a far larger world. For the first time, Uruk's merchants could trade with lands as distant as Egypt and India without leaving imperial territory. The city had joined a new kind of empire, one of highways and bureaucracy rather than conquest and fear. Under Persian rule, Uruk's scholars adapted again. Their astronomical tables expanded, their mathematics refined. Cuneiform tablets from this period show astonishingly complex calculations, proto-algebra used to track planetary movement. The scribes had become the empire's quiet mathematicians, their clay notebooks, the scientific journals of the ancient world. Still, something in the air had changed. Greek visitors passing through in later centuries would describe Uruk as a place of immense antiquity, where priests in white robes moved silently through echoing courtyards, and the people spoke of their gods in tones of nostalgia. The great ziggurats still stood, but the bricks were crumbling. The canals glistened less. Civilization had turned contemplative. Yet that too was a form of triumph. Uruk had achieved what Gilgamesh could not. It had grown old with dignity. Its immortality was not in conquest, but in continuity, in the steady endurance of ritual scholarship and memory. When the evening wind swept across the plains and rustled through the reeds, the people of Uruk would have heard what their ancestors heard 3,000 years before: the whisper of water, the murmur of the gods, and the faint hum of a city that refused to die. And so, as Babylon blazed in the sunset of its own empire, and Persia rose beyond it, Uruk remained ancient, watchful, and utterly itself. The world had changed again, but the city that once taught humanity to build, to write, and to dream still stood at the crossroads of time, the living echo of civilization's first heartbeat. When Cyrus the Great marched into Mesopotamia in 539 BC, the world did not end in thunder or fire. No ziggurat toppled, no walls were breached. The soldiers of Uruk saw no siege towers on the horizon, heard no clash of bronze against stone. Instead, the Persian banners arrived, like the morning tide, steady, inevitable, and strangely gentle. The Babylonians, weary of their own kings, had opened the gates of their capital without a fight. And so, Cyrus, the ruler of a new and astonishing kind of empire, inherited all that had once been Babylon's, its cities, its gods, and its ancient heartbeat Uruk among them. The Persians called their dominion not a conquest, but a restoration of order. After centuries of empires that shouted, Cyrus built one that spoke softly. In Uruk, life changed in a way that must have felt both strange and familiar. For generations, the city had survived invaders by adapting, and now it adapted again, this time to a conqueror who did not seek to erase its past, but to manage it. Persian governors, or satraps, arrived to oversee the region. They spoke in measured tones, carried official seals on parchment instead of clay, and brought with them the empire's greatest innovations: standardized coinage, efficient roads, and an administration that could make even the gods feel itemized. The Achaemenid Empire, as it came to be known, ruled not by terror, but by paperwork. Cyrus believed in what his scribes called the policy of tolerance. Every people could worship their own gods, speak their own tongue, and keep their own customs, so long as they paid their taxes and obeyed imperial law. For the priests of Uruk, this was a blessing. After centuries of nervous negotiations with conquering kings, they could once again offer incense to Anu and Ishtar without fear of blasphemy. And so, the old rituals continued. Each morning, smoke curled above the Iana temple, drifting across the rooftops as it had since the dawn of cities. Offerings of grain and oil filled the storerooms. The festivals of the goddess went on, though the hymns were sung now in a mixture of Akkadian Aramaic and even Persian. The priests understood that language didn't matter, continuity did. But beneath the prayers, a quieter revolution was underway. The Persians reshaped Mesopotamia not through divine decree, but through engineering and administration. Across the south, new canals were dug and old ones repaired, linking Uruk more efficiently to the Euphrates and the wider trade networks of the empire. The irrigation that had once been managed by temple labor now fell under the jurisdiction of imperial inspectors who arrived with tablets of polished wood and silver coins instead of clay tallies. The very concept of money changed. Where earlier merchants had measured wealth in barley or silver by weight, Persian coinage brought the promise of something far simpler and far more universal. A stamped disc of metal now carried value across thousands of miles from the Aegean to the Indus. For the first time, an artisan in Uruk could be paid in gold that had once changed hands in Sardis or Persepolis. The old scribes, accustomed to their clay ledgers, must have shaken their heads at the sheer audacity of it, an empire where numbers, not gods, governed trust. The Persians were not builders of temples, but of systems. They preferred efficiency to glory. In Uruk, this meant that while the ziggurats still stood rebuilt again during the Babylonian period, it no longer dominated the city's identity. The new rulers had no need to climb its terraces to commune with the heavens. They communed instead through decrees, taxes, and road networks that bound half the known world together. And yet in their way, the Persians shared the same instinct that had driven Uruk's earliest kings, the desire to impose order upon the chaos of the world. The empire's bureaucrats were heirs to the scribes of Sumer, their ledgers, the descendants of the temple archives. In a sense, the Persians had merely expanded the logic of Uruk to its natural conclusion, civilization scaled up to continental size. It was an empire of pragmatism. Soldiers became surveyors, priests became clerks, and kings became administrators of divine paperwork. In Susa and Persepolis, inscriptions declared that Cyrus and his successors ruled by the will of Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth. But in practice, their faith lay equally in irrigation schedules and tax records. Even the gods one suspects needed a good filing system. For the people of Uruk, the Persian peace was a paradox: less glory, more stability. The wars and conquests that had battered the city for centuries gave way to a long, unremarkable calm. The canals ran on time. The harvests came. Merchants traveled freely along the royal road that linked Mesopotamia to Asia Minor and beyond. From the highlands of Iran came fine horses, from the Gulf spices and pearls. The markets of Uruk, though smaller than in its prime, once again filled with color and conversation. Imagine walking through those streets around 500 BC. The walls are patched, but still standing. The smell of bread and oil drifts from courtyards. A Persian official passes by in his long robe, followed by a scribe carrying a leather ledger. Nearby, an old priest sprinkles water on the temple steps, muttering words in a language already ancient to his own ears. Somewhere, a child plays with a clay toy shaped like a goat, exactly as a child had done 3,000 years earlier. The empire had changed everything, and yet nothing at all. Cyrus himself died far from Uruk, campaigning against tribes on the empire's edge. But the city he spared outlived him, as it had outlived every conqueror before. When his successor, Darius I, restructured the empire into provinces and introduced the famous Behistun inscriptions, Uruk's name was listed among the lands that paid tribute peacefully. That was its new role in history, not as a rebel, not as a capital, but as a cornerstone of civilization itself. It is almost poetic that Uruk, the first city built from mud and imagination, found its twilight under a ruler who governed through tolerance and balance rather than divine fire. The Persians perhaps unknowingly honored Uruk's oldest dream, that stability could be sacred, that peace could be a form of grandeur. By the end of the 6th century BC, the city's ziggurat still cast its shadow across the plain, but the sound of hammers and marching feet had faded. In their place came the softer sounds of quills, scratching on parchment coins, clinking in exchange water, gurgling in newly dredged canals. It was a different kind of majesty, the majesty of systems that worked. Uruk had entered the age of empires and survived by doing what it always did best: adapting. No longer a city of kings, it became a city of clerks, astronomers, and quiet persistence. Its greatness had shifted from conquest to continuity. When Alexander the Great's army thundered across Mesopotamia in 331 BC, Uruk did not fight. The city had seen conquerors before: Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and had learned the oldest lesson of civilization: survival favors. Those who adapt faster than the next ruler can issue a decree. So when the Greeks came with their polished bronze armor and philosophers in tow, Uruk simply tilted its head and said, "All right, then let's see what language we're speaking this time." Alexander's conquest was swift and astonishing. After defeating Darius III at Gaugamela, he swept through Babylon, crowned himself king of Asia, and suddenly the world's oldest city found itself part of something brand new, a global experiment called the Hellenistic world. For the first time, the rhythms of the Aegean mingled with those of the Euphrates. In the markets of Uruk, one might hear a Babylonian trader haggling in Aramaic, a Persian clerk reading an imperial edict, and now, perhaps most shockingly, a Greek soldier trying to pronounce Inanna with heroic confidence and absolutely failing. After Alexander's early death, his generals carved up the empire like impatient heirs dividing a will. Mesopotamia fell to the Seleucid dynasty, and with them came a second, quieter conquest, not of swords, but of culture. The Seleucids adored the idea of bringing civilization to ancient lands, blissfully unaware that Uruk had been doing civilization since long before Homer's ancestors learned to fish. They arrived with architects and administrators introducing new urban fashions, gymnasiums for exercise, and debate theaters for plays and civic gatherings, colonnaded courtyards, and broad avenues paved with limestone. In Uruk, the old mud-brick streets sprouted bits of marble and mosaic. The ziggurat still loomed at the center, but now a small amphitheater rose nearby, a curved arc of stone benches where locals could watch Greek comedies translated somewhat awkwardly into Aramaic. Imagine Aristophanes' bawdy jokes performed before a crowd of priests who'd spent their lives chanting hymns to Inanna. If there was confusion, it was surely mutual. The blending went deeper than architecture. In the administrative halls, contracts began to appear bilingually, Akkadian cuneiform on one side, Greek alphabet on the other. A land lease might begin with, "By the grace of Anu and Zeus," as if the two deities had finally agreed to share office space. Even taxes were recorded in both drachmas and silver shekels, because cultural fusion, while noble in theory, always ends with someone arguing about the exchange rate. To a traveler, Uruk in this period must have felt dazzlingly cosmopolitan. Greek settlers mingled with Babylonian scribes and Persian merchants. The air rang with mixed tongues, and scents roasted lamb with olive oil incense with Mediterranean wine. Scholars met in shaded courtyards to discuss both Aristotle's logic and Anu's constellations. The gymnasium, that proud Greek institution, became as much an academy as a training ground. Young men studied mathematics and rhetoric by day, then wandered up the ziggurat at night to observe the heavens according to Chaldean methods. It was improbably a place where Zeus met Anu, where philosophy and astrology compared notes over cups of watered wine. And yet the old city refused to be overwritten. Beneath the new Hellenic veneer, the pulse of Sumer still beat steadily. The priests continued to recite hymns in Sumerian, their language, now ancient and ceremonial, like Latin in a medieval cathedral. The astronomers still recorded planetary paths on clay tablets, even as younger scribes switched to ink and papyrus. Old habits die hard when they're 5,000 years old. What's striking about this era is how little friction there seems to have been. The Seleucid kings, practical men governing a patchwork empire, realized quickly that it was easier to work with Uruk's traditions than against them. They sponsored temple restorations, donated to local cults, and even adopted titles that echoed those of Babylonian rulers, king of the lands, shepherd of the people. If the Greeks had come expecting to civilize the barbarians, Uruk quietly turned the tables, civilizing the Greeks instead. One inscription from the time of Antiochus III shows just how thorough the blending had become. It records the dedication of a new shrine to Anu and Antu, but the accompanying ceremony included Greek hymns, sacrificial bulls in the Hellenic style, and offerings of olive oil imported from the West. The priests, ever pragmatic, interpreted this as a divine merger, Anu Zeus, king of heaven, under a dual brand. Somewhere in the afterlife, the Sumerian gods probably rolled their eyes, but appreciated the rebranding effort. Commerce flourished under this new cosmopolitan peace. The Seleucid administration improved roads and security, making travel across the empire safer than it had been in centuries. Uruk's merchants traded textiles, bitumen, and dates for Greek wine, Egyptian papyrus, and Anatolian metals. The city's canals were deepened again, and travelers wrote of pleasure boats drifting past the ziggurat, their decks lit by oil lamps as musicians played soft reed flutes. It was no longer the roaring industrial heart of Sumer, but it had evolved into something gentler, a scholarly port, a crossroads of languages and ideas. At night, one could imagine walking through Uruk's streets under the torchlight, young scholars in Greek chitons debating the nature of the cosmos with priests in linen robes. Women selling amphorae of imported wine beside stalls of barley and honey. And in the distance, laughter rising from the small theater as actors performed some philosophical farce about the futility of ambition. Civilization had come full circle. It had rediscovered the joy of irony. But beneath the humor, there was something bittersweet. The scribes who still pressed clay tablets knew that their craft was fading. Each year, fewer students learned the old signs. Papyrus was faster, Greek simpler. A few devoted masters refused to abandon the stylus, treating every tablet as an act of resistance. In one late inscription, a weary scribe added a personal note at the bottom of a temple inventory: "The old words endure. The new men do not understand them." A quiet lament written by a man who realized he was recording not just numbers, but extinction. Even so, Uruk thrived. The fusion of Greek and Mesopotamian thought produced astonishing results, mathematics that hinted at geometry, astrology edging toward astronomy, and philosophy that blended logic with myth. The city became a repository of both worlds, the last great workshop of ideas before the age of empires turned mechanical. By the 2nd century BC, the city's skyline told its story. The ancient ziggurat repaired yet again. The Iana temple complex, fragrant with incense. The marble colonnades of a Hellenistic gymnasium catching the morning light. Old gods and new shared the same horizon. It wasn't conquest, it was coexistence, the kind that happens only in places too old to bother with purity. By the time the Parthian Empire rose to power in the 2nd century, BC Uruk was already an elder statesman of cities, ancient wise, and content to watch history loop back on itself yet again. The Seleucid kings had come and gone, like the seasons leaving their Greek theaters and gymnasiums to fade under the desert sun. And now, from the Iranian plateau, new riders thundered westward, Parthian horsemen, their scale armor glinting, their banners rippling like flames. They conquered with precision, ruled with tolerance, and traded with everyone. The world was shifting again, but this time the current brought wealth instead of war. For the first time in its long, weary life, Uruk found itself positioned not on the edge of empire, but at the heart of a global trade network that spanned continents. The Parthians controlled the vast lands between Rome and China, and through their realm ran the arteries of commerce that would later be called the Silk Road. Uruk, once the mother of bureaucracy, now became the grandmother of globalization. Picture it, the year is around 50 BC. The canals have been dredged again, their waters alive with reflection and movement. Barges stacked with amphorae drift lazily downstream, their hulls heavy with wine from Syria, glass from Rome, spices from Arabia, and most exotic of all, silk from the Far East. The traders who handle it speak in a dozen tongues: Aramaic, Parthian, Greek, Persian, and a smattering of Chinese for good measure. A caravan from the east arrives, its camels dusty and slow, led by men from Bactria and Sogdia, with sun-darkened faces and laughter like gravel. Behind them trail Persian porters, Indian jewel merchants, and a handful of Syrians carrying papyrus scrolls wrapped in linen. In the marketplace near the old ziggurat, they barter beneath awnings that flap like sails in the wind. Bronze coins clink against silver drachmas. Contracts are signed in ink, stamped with seals that bear symbols both Greek and Babylonian. Uruk has become once again what it was always meant to be: a crossroads, a living intersection of worlds. Its population is a kaleidoscope of humanity. Greek merchants still keep their ledgers beside Babylonian scribes, who cling to the last vestiges of cuneiform. Jewish traders exiled from the West have built a small quarter near the river. Their Sabbath songs mingle with the chants of Zoroastrian priests who burn sacred fire on their altars. Nabatean spice sellers bring incense from Arabia. Caravaneers from the east carry jade and cinnamon. The air smells of cardamom oil and the faint tang of the river. In the temple courtyards, the gods themselves seem to have merged in the same cosmopolitan spirit. The statue of Ishtar now stands beside shrines to Mithra, the Persian god of light, and contracts whose cult will soon spread as far as Rome. Over the temple gates are new carvings of winged suns and celestial lions, symbols shared from Persia to India. The priests, ever pragmatic, perform rituals that blend half a dozen traditions, bowing to Anu, invoking Ahura Mazda, and lighting incense in honor of the Greek Apollo. Uruk, it seems, has decided that when in doubt, worship everyone. Even the architecture of the city has become a fusion of styles. The ziggurat, now more eroded mound than tower, is patched with Parthian brickwork. Its terraces serve as both temple platform and astronomical observatory. Around it rise mansions with columned courtyards, Greek in form, Persian in decor. The old canal bridges have been reinforced with stone arches copied from Roman designs. Traders from Antioch marvel that such an ancient place feels strangely modern, as though time itself had decided to loop back around and start over. And the people of Uruk, practical as ever, have learned to live within this mosaic of cultures. A scribe might begin his day offering prayers to the old gods, spend his afternoon drafting contracts in Aramaic for a Greek merchant, and end his evening sharing pomegranate wine with a Parthian tax collector. The city hums with the rhythm of cooperation. Where the empires of old demanded uniformity, the Parthians rule through loose confederation, a patchwork of local dynasties, each free to keep its gods, its laws, and its sense of self. For Uruk, that tolerance feels like a second wind. Its temples are again centers of both religion and science. Astronomers continue to track the movements of the stars, refining the tables that will later influence Greek and Islamic astronomy alike. One can imagine them, on clear nights, standing atop the ziggurat's terrace, measuring the heavens with cords and rods as caravans glitter faintly on the horizon. Below them, the streets come alive with light. Oil lamps line the doorways of taverns where musicians play the oud and reed flute, their melodies flowing like the river. In the courtyards, travelers share stories of distant wonders: jade palaces in China, marble arenas in Rome, gold markets in India. Uruk has become a listening post to the world, collecting rumors and treasures with equal enthusiasm. There's a gentle irony in it all. The city that once invented bureaucracy is now thriving on freedom. The priests who once managed every grain of barley now manage cosmic data. The merchants who once feared conquest now trade with empires that will never meet. The world has caught up to Uruk's old dream, a web of connection across lands and languages. And yet amid this hum of prosperity, a quiet melancholy lingers. The language of the scribe Sumerian has finally fallen silent, kept alive only as a scholarly curiosity. The last cuneiform tablets are written not for commerce, but for nostalgia, copied by scholars who know they are preserving a relic. They press the wedges with reverence, perhaps smiling at the thought that their ancestors invented the art of recording the world, and here they are, still at it, in a world that now writes on papyrus. Still, the rhythm of daily life continues as it always has. At dawn, the priests climb the temple steps to greet the rising sun. In the market, a Greek trader haggles with a Parthian over silk prices. Children chase each other along the canal banks, their laughter echoing off the worn stones of the city that refuses to die. Uruk in the Parthian age is no longer the mighty heart of civilization, but it has become something gentler, almost timeless. It is a memory that has learned to breathe a living museum of human coexistence. From the terraces, you can see the caravans departing westward, their loads glittering in the sun. Chinese silk, Roman glass, Arabian incense, Indian gems, all converging through this old Sumerian cradle. The wheels creak, the bells jingle, the dust rises, and somewhere between the shimmer of heat and the murmur of trade, you realize that Uruk's pulse never truly stopped. It just changed tempo. By the dawn of the 3rd century, A.D., Uruk was like an aged scholar in fine robes, no longer young, but still wise enough to earn the respect of new empires. The Parthians had ruled long and loosely, but their power eventually frayed at the edges. Out of the highlands of Persia came a fresh wind, fierce and reforming the Sasanians. Their banners gleamed with fire symbols, their kings wore crowns shaped like suns, and they arrived not to plunder, but to revive. To the Sasanians, empire was not a collection of cities. It was a creed. They built their legitimacy on the faith of Zoroastrianism, where cosmic order battled eternal chaos, where light itself was sacred. And so across Mesopotamia, fire temples rose, whitewashed sanctuaries with domed roofs and ever-burning flames that symbolized purity. In Uruk, one such fire temple stood near the ruins of the old Iana precinct. It was said that its altar flame had burned without interruption for decades, tended by priests who whispered hymns in Middle Persian. To the Sasanian mind, this was not blasphemy against the old gods, but their evolution. The eternal flame was Anu's sky, and Shamash's sunlight, reborn in another theology. The new rulers rebuilt the canals and reactivated the trade routes that had once pulsed through the land. Under their governance, the old southern cities Ur-Larsa and venerable Uruk experienced a final renaissance of prosperity. Silk looms clattered again in the workshops. Caravanserais filled with traders from India and Byzantium. Warehouses bulged with bales of cotton jars, of wine sacks of spices, and blocks of glass from Antioch and Alexandria. Persian administrators cataloged everything, recording taxes in neat scripts on parchment instead of clay. Civilization, as always had, learned a new medium, but kept the same obsessions. What made the Sasanian age remarkable was its plurality. Uruk, never content to be monolithic, had become a tapestry of creeds. In the shadow of the fire temples stood Christian churches, built by Eastern congregations who followed Nestorian and Syriac traditions. Their bells rang at dawn beside the priests' fire chants. Their hymns mingled with the call of merchants in the market. Jewish families, long established in Mesopotamia since Babylonian exile, kept their own Sabbaths in quiet homes along the canals. There were even whispers of small communities still honoring Ishtar and Anu. Their rituals, now private ancestral gestures, carried out in the twilight hours before dawn. The people of Uruk had lived through empires enough to recognize that gods changed uniforms, but the human heart did not. The festivals still came, the feasts still lit the nights, and the river still shimmered with reflections of lamps. The city might have been smaller than in its golden days, but it retained a cosmopolitan dignity, a sense of being older than all quarrels. In those years, the Sasanians clashed often with Byzantium, their great western rival. Armies marched north and west, leaving behind the dust of conquest, but also the exchange of goods and ideas. Along these routes, Uruk thrived as a way station for traders and officials, a borderless zone between faiths and frontiers. Silk from China, glass from Rome, pearls from the Gulf, and perfumes from Arabia passed through its gates. It was as though the old spirit of trade had returned for a curtain call before history's next act. But empires, like rivers, inevitably shift their course. By the early 7th century, the Sasanian kingdom, magnificent, confident, overextended, was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Decades of war with Byzantium had drained its coffers. Famine crept in. The canals clogged again. Then from the western deserts came another wind, hot, swift, and unrelenting. The year was 633 AD, when the first Arab armies crossed the Euphrates. They came not in splendor, but in simplicity, riders in plain cloaks bearing the banner of a new faith, Islam. They did not claim to bring a god unknown to Mesopotamia, but rather to reveal the one that had always been there. To the weary cities of the south, their message was both alien and familiar. There is no need for idols, no need for fire or gold, only a single unseen light. When they reached Uruk, there was no great battle. The city, by then half empty and half memory, opened its gates as it had done for conquerors since time began. The Arab commanders respected its age and spared its temples. The priests extinguished their flames quietly, their hands trembling, not with anger, but with understanding. They had seen too many dawns to fear another one. The new rulers established governors and garrisons, but they brought something the land had not felt in centuries: stability without grandeur. Taxes were collected, trade resumed, and for a while life continued almost unchanged. But the old religions, Zoroastrian, Christian, Jewish, Sumerian, began to retreat into whispers. Arabic replaced Aramaic in the markets. New prayers echoed where old hymns once rose. The scribes laid down their pens. The language of the first tablets fell silent at last. And yet Uruk endured in a subtler form. The canals still glistened under the sun. The clay still bore the fingerprints of its makers. Children played among the fallen bricks of temples whose names they no longer knew. A shepherd might pass by the ruins of the ziggurat and not realize that beneath his feet lay the first foundations of written history. The Arab historians, who later chronicled their conquests, spoke of this region with awe. They called it Bilad al-Sawad, the land of black soil, the fertile heart of the world. They noted its old cities, its canals, its vast history, and even they could not help but speak of Uruk with reverence. In their writings, it became a symbol of what had been before Islam, a city from the time of the prophets, half-remembered, half-myth. And so, the lamps of the ancient world faded one by one. The fire temples went cold, their domes left open to the sky. The churches emptied. The old ziggurat melted further into the dust. But there was no tragedy in it, only quiet dignity. Uruk had played its part in the great human story and knew when to bow out. It had invented cities, writing law, and the notion that human effort could touch the divine. What remained to prove, when the dust of the Arab conquests finally settled, Uruk slipped quietly out of history's active memory. It did not fall in battle or vanish in flame. It simply faded grain by grain, year by year, into the desert that had once given it life. The canals that for millennia had laced the city like blue veins began to silt up, choked by neglect and the slow retreat of the Euphrates. Without the constant labor of clearing and repair the irrigation system that had once sustained hundreds of thousands of people succumbed to the same law that governs all human order entropy. The water withdrew, the fields cracked, and the fishermen became shepherds. By the 9th century, Uruk was a village of ghosts. The great ziggurat of Anu was nothing but a mound of mud brick, its terraces eroded into natural slopes. Local villagers called it Tel Warka, the mound of Warka, not realizing that beneath their feet lay the bones of the world's first city. To them, it was simply a convenient quarry. They dug into its layers, pried out bricks, stamped with the names of kings they could not read, and used them to build houses and mosques. In the quiet evenings, as they lit fires beside their reed huts, no one guessed that they were sitting atop 5,000 years of memory. For centuries, only a handful of travelers passed this way: Persian tax collectors, Arab geographers, the occasional Christian monk tracing the route of the prophets. The medieval scholars of Baghdad wrote of a ruin called Erech or Erech, believing it to be one of the cities mentioned in the book of Genesis. They imagined it as the home of Nimrod, the hunter before the Lord. The connection was half legend, half intuition, but they were right about one thing: Uruk's story had become biblical. The wind ruled the city now. It hissed through the empty canals, whispered over the low mounds, and carried the last fragments of walls away grain by grain. Goats grazed among the ruins. Shepherd boys found odd lumps of baked clay tablets inscribed with wedge marks and skipped them across the water, never realizing they were tossing away history's earliest sentences. Time flattened everything. Empires rose elsewhere: Baghdad, Samarra, Cairo, while Uruk slept patient as only the dead can be. Then in the 19th century, the world came looking for its origins. Europe had discovered its appetite for antiquity. Scholars and adventurers roamed the deserts of the Near East spades, in hand searching for the lost cities of the Bible and the myths of Mesopotamia. Their caravans arrived with camels, tents, and fragile optimism. They looked upon the windswept mounds of Warka and felt a stirring they couldn't quite name. The first digs began around 1850, led by the British and Germans. The archaeologists pitched their camps where once priests had stood, brushing dust from broken bricks, still bearing the royal seals of Uruk's kings. Each day, they uncovered fragments, cylinder seals, carved with divine figures, pottery painted in geometric spirals, and most astonishing of all, clay tablets covered in cuneiform. The decipherment of cuneiform had only just begun in Europe, and when the scholars realized what they were holding, the desert itself seemed to exhale. Here were the world's first written words pressed into clay more than 5,000 years before. Receipts, hymns, lists, myths, the scribbles of ancient accountants and poets alike. From those fragments, the story of humanity's awakening began to reassemble itself. It must have been a strange and holy feeling, brushing sand from a tablet and realizing that the marks beneath your fingertips were made by the first hand ever to record thought. The archaeologists of Warka, with their trowels and notebooks, had stumbled upon civilization's first memory card. In the decades that followed, excavation teams peeled back the layers of the mound like pages of a book. Each stratum revealed another era: Persian bricks, Babylonian courtyards, Ur III storehouses, and finally beneath them, all the raw clay foundations of the earliest Uruk period houses of reed and mud from the 4th millennium BC. It was as if the earth itself had been waiting for someone to read it again. The discoveries were staggering. The Warka vase, a carved alabaster vessel depicting the world's first narrative scene. The Warka mask, a serene marble face thought to represent Inanna herself, the earliest evidence of urban planning, ziggurat construction, and written language. Suddenly, the myths of Sumer were not myths at all, they were archaeology. Newspapers in London and Berlin announced the finds with breathless wonder. The public, who had grown up on the Bible and Greek history, were confronted with a revelation. Civilization had begun not in Egypt, not in Athens, but here in the dust of Iraq. Uruk had been the blueprint, the first draft of humanity's great experiment. But while scholars debated dates and dynasties, the ruins themselves remained serene. The wind still swept across the tell. The villagers still grazed their goats nearby. The archaeologists packed their finds into crates and sent them north along the river, and once again, silence settled. Uruk had spoken, and then, as always, it waited. Today, if you stand among those mounds, the scene feels both desolate and intimate. The desert hums with cicadas. The air smells faintly of salt and old water. The outlines of walls are faintly visible under the sand, ghostly grids that once held the first neighborhoods, the first bureaucracies, the first dreams of permanence. The sun sets in the west, turning the dunes to gold, and you realize the same light once fell on the gleaming plaster of a new ziggurat. Nothing endures, and yet everything echoes. Because in a way, Uruk never truly died. It simply migrated into every city that came after. When we build roads and aqueducts, when we keep ledgers and laws, when we write to remember, we are repeating what was first imagined here. The rhythm of the city, the pulse of commerce, and faith and language, all of it was born beneath these sands. The archaeologists left, but Uruk remained its story, scattered across museums and history books, its memory lodged in our collective mind. The first word ever written, the first wall ever raised, the first story ever told, they all began in this patch of earth where reeds once grew beside the river. Every city skyline today, from New York to Tokyo, owes something to Uruk, the notion that people can come together, build upward, and leave behind marks that outlast them. And perhaps that is the true afterlife the Sumerians were seeking. Not paradise, not immortality, but remembrance. In the end, Uruk's silence was not defeat. It was fulfillment, the long exhale after 5 millennia of teaching humanity how to live.